It's unlikely that there are people in the world who have never faced rejection. The only difference is that some take it calmly and move on, while others remember the rejection for the rest of their lives. What do you think a rejected man is capable of? And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. I just wanted to see her naked. That's how the man who took the life of a girl he had been obsessed with for 5 years explained his actions. A wave of rage overwhelmed him completely. How dare Alicia say such a thing? He paced around the room, thinking of ways to hurt the one who had dared to reject him. That year was supposed to be the most significant one for the young university student. 2 major events were ahead that could completely change her life. But the girl's trip to a wedding as a companion ended in tragedy. The events of today's story take place in August 2012 in Plainfield, a town in Will and Kendall counties in the state of Illinois, USA. Let's go back more than 12 years. In front of you is 21-year-old Alicia Bromfield. Alicia was born on August 28, 1990, to Sherry and James in the city of Joliet, Illinois. Joliet was located about 15 kilometers from Plainfield. Alicia was one of 5 children, but despite any hardships, she always found a reason to enjoy life. The girl approached any problems with laughter and lightness, and her optimism was contagious. With younger siblings, she was used to solving her problems on her own and not bothering her parents over little things. It was this very habit that cost her her life. At the time of the incident, Alicia was a graduate of Joliet Catholic Academy and a student at Western Illinois University. She had just a couple of months left before earning her degree in criminal justice and forensic psychology. Since childhood, she had dreamed of a legal career and was rapidly moving toward her goal. However, that wasn't the only significant upcoming event in her life. Alicia was soon to become a mother. She was 6 months pregnant. At the same time, she was preparing to become a single mother while building a career in forensic psychology. Alicia had met a guy in college. They had dated for some time. But when she got pregnant, her boyfriend, the father of the child, did not want to take responsibility for the baby and broke up with Alicia, leaving her to deal with the situation on her own. Still, Alicia wasn't going to let it get her down. Of course, she was scared to be left alone with a newborn in her arms. But she had a good support system, including family and friends. She was already prepared to fight through whatever difficulties might come her way. Alicia was over the moon when she found out the gender of her baby. She was going to have a girl. Alicia had even chosen a name for her little one, Ava Lucille. She couldn't wait to finally meet her daughter. The young woman was emotionally prepared for motherhood. She knew money would be tight, considering the fact that she had only one source of income to support both herself and the baby. So, throughout her pregnancy, Alicia was buying baby clothes and other items she would need when Ava was born. Bottles, diapers, little sweaters, and onesies. Alicia was very lucky with her job. She worked as a florist at a garden center, decorating the storefront of a flower shop and making bouquets for customers. At the same time, she was able to combine college with her job, which was seasonal. In the winter, the student had time off, but she still received a regular paycheck, as that period was considered paid leave. Alicia had worked at the garden center for about 6 years, starting in her teenage years. Baby Ava Lucille was expected to arrive in early winter 2012. That was exactly when final exams at the university would be over and her vacation from work would begin. The expectant mother was very fortunate to have the chance to gradually adjust to her new role and spend the first months after the birth with her child. After that, she planned to return to work at the garden center. And once Ava Lucille was a little older, she could begin building her legal career. It seemed that 21-year-old Alicia Bromfield's life was moving in the right direction. She had many important milestones ahead that she was eagerly anticipating, from earning her degree in forensic psychology to welcoming her baby girl into the world. And Alicia truly was happy. But she would never get to experience the most significant moments of her life because in the summer of 2012, she became the victim of a truly horrific crime. On the morning of Sunday, August 19th, 2012, a 36-year-old man walked into a gas station in Door County, Wisconsin, and approached an employee. For some reason, his clothes were soaking wet. The stranger asked the gas station worker if he could use the phone to call emergency services, 911, to report an emergency. The employee dialed the number himself, and when the operator answered, he handed the phone to the strange visitor. That's when the man in the soaking wet clothes said he wanted to report a crime. He confessed that the previous evening he had taken the life of a young pregnant woman in a hotel room. The dispatcher asked if it had been an accident, to which the man calmly replied that it had been done intentionally. He then added that actually he was a good person, except for what he had done the night before. Alicia's family would be devastated to learn that she was no longer alive, because she was the young woman whose murder the strange man had just reported in the phone call. Who was this mysterious man standing in soaking wet clothes at the gas station? And how did a pregnant girl end up in a hotel room in a resort town in Door County, Wisconsin? Brian Cooper was 36 years old. He was 15 years older than Alicia and was her direct supervisor. Alicia worked as a florist, while Brian Cooper was a regional manager for the garden centers of a retail company. They had worked together for about 5 years. At first, Cooper seemed to Alicia like a very nice and friendly person. He directly managed her work, kept track of her schedule, and oversaw her responsibilities. They got along very well and soon became good friends. Sometimes Alicia even walked his dog, which is why she had a key to Brian's house. When she first started working at the garden center, she was still a teenager and would jump at any chance to earn some money. The request from her boss to look after his pet and take it for walks felt like a way to please him and earn a small reward at the same time. She had no idea what was really behind that seemingly innocent request. But it soon became clear that Brian liked Alicia more than just as a friend. He clearly had romantic feelings for her, despite the significant age difference. He would often make inappropriate comments about her, and sometimes introduced Alicia to new employees as his girlfriend, even though there had never been any romantic relationship between them. He used his authority and job position to control nearly every aspect of her life, constantly trying to get closer to her. Brian repeatedly tried to lure her into the back storage area under the pretense of work matters, only to try and kiss her. He would call and text her on weekends. He would get angry and jealous if he saw her talking to other male co-workers, and sometimes wouldn't even let her take a lunch break if he found out she wouldn't be eating alone. Brian made it clear in every possible way that he was physically attracted to Alicia. Despite all this, Alicia never reciprocated his feelings. She constantly rejected her boss's advances and tried to stay under the radar so as not to provoke him. The thing was, this job suited her perfectly because of its seasonal nature. She could study peacefully and still earn a decent income. Besides, she had started working there when she was only 16. She enjoyed working with flowers, enjoyed interacting with customers. The only thing she didn't like was that Brian kept pushing for a relationship. At such a young age, her boss seemed almost like an old man to her, and Alicia found his advances unpleasant. But in her youthful naivety, she believed that sooner or later Brian's desire would fade and he would leave her alone. Alicia wasn't in a position, either in age or circumstance, to properly put her boss in his place and set clear personal boundaries. She knew that her continued employment at the garden center depended directly on Brian. On top of that, Alicia wasn't exactly confrontational. Her gentle and non-confrontational nature likely gave him even more reason to believe that the student was just playing hard to get. In reality, Alicia had made several attempts to explain to Brian that she wasn't attracted to him as a man, that it was inappropriate to use his position of power, and that she had completely different preferences when it came to men. But she always did this with her usual delicacy and friendliness, not wanting to turn Brian against her, and so she never achieved any real results. After failing to gain her affection, Her boss became incredibly cruel and began to openly abuse his position. He moved from persistent advances to verbal abuse, yelling and cursing at Alicia over the slightest thing, and even calling her awful names like whore and easy woman, though in much cruder terms. He could insult her right in front of customers, causing her to run off to the back room in tears. Upper management at the company was fully aware of the regional manager's inappropriate behavior, but took no action against him. According to court documents, Alicia had filed multiple complaints about Brian Cooper and his misconduct, but nothing was done. He wasn't fired or even suspended. He was simply asked to complete an anger management course, and no one even bothered to check if he had followed through with it. Alicia felt trapped in a job she loved, working under a boss she despised, who controlled her every move. She did her job well, and considering she was only 21 years old and about to become a single mother, the job was especially important to her. Time went on, but the man didn't stop. Sometimes he would change tactics and return to being the caring, understanding friend. And sometimes he would transform into a beast, not just yelling, but even throwing objects at her in fits of rage. Worst of all, because of his position, Brian could easily assign Alicia to a work trip and go with her himself. She tried to set boundaries, but it didn't go well. She was afraid to tell her parents, believing she had to handle the problem on her own, and often felt alone and defenseless in the face of her threatening boss. Alicia understood that if she wanted to keep her job, she needed to find a way to get along with him, and she tried to act gently so she wouldn't end up without a means to support herself. The more she tried to stay out of Brian's way, the more complaints he had about her, and the more twisted his demands became. It was precisely out of fear of losing her job that Alicia ended up in the situation that led to the tragedy. Her pregnancy didn't deter her boss. He still wanted Alicia to be his girlfriend, and knowing that the young employee was preparing to become a mother and needed extra income, Brian threatened to fire her or cut her hours if she didn't comply with his demands. Brian would deliberately schedule a shift for the same day Alicia had a doctor's appointment, forcing her to change her plans. She only had to hold on for a couple more months before going on maternity leave, and it seemed she was willing to endure some inconvenience and turn a blind eye to her boss's behavior to make it to that point. In August 2012, Brian began persuading Alicia to accompany him to his sister's wedding in a neighboring state as his guest. His sister was getting married in Wisconsin, and Brian was supposed to walk her down the aisle. He assured his employee that he simply needed friendly support, nothing more. But when Alicia refused, he once again threatened to fire her. Fearing the thought of losing her job, Alicia agreed, but only on the condition that they stay in separate hotel rooms. She really didn't want to go, but now that she was expecting a baby, she couldn't afford to lose her job. Above all, Alicia was thinking of her daughter. Deep down, she hoped that maybe this trip would somehow soften Brian's harsh demeanor and that he would stop bothering her, at least for a while. Either way, early in the morning on Saturday, August 18, 2012, Brian and Alicia left Plainfield, Illinois, and made the 4-hour drive to Door County, Wisconsin, where Brian's sister's wedding was taking place. Alicia's mother, Sherry, knew how her boss treated her daughter and begged her not to go to the wedding. But Alicia said she had no choice. She promised her mom she would return the day after the wedding, but she never made it home. On August 19, 2012, Brian Cooper walked into a gas station in Door County and asked the attendant to use the phone. He told the dispatcher that he had taken the life of his pregnant employee, Alicia Bromfield. After the phone call, police officers were immediately dispatched to the gas station. They quickly arrested Brian Cooper and took him to the station for questioning. At the same time, another group of law enforcement officers was sent to the hotel where Alicia and Brian had been staying. It turned out that Brian had booked a room for them at a resort hotel in Door County. But he had lied to Alicia when he told her they would have separate rooms and that the other wedding guests would also be staying at the same hotel. Upon arrival, Alicia sent a message to her mother saying that she and Brian had argued and were about to drive home. She was upset that he had once again deceived her. Alicia's mother, Sherry, was surprised that Brian would miss the wedding. After all, he was supposed to walk his sister down the aisle. Apparently, Brian himself realized that he had behaved poorly and apologized to Alicia, blaming the situation on the resort hotel having no available rooms. The two still ended up attending the ceremony because Alicia was primarily thinking about Brian's sister. She didn't want to ruin the celebration for the newlyweds or come off as disrespectful. Later that day, when Sherry asked her daughter how things were going, Alicia replied that everything was fine and that she and Brian had decided to stay for the party, spend the night, and return the next day as originally planned. The wedding itself went well, and the ceremony took place outdoors. Brian fulfilled his role of walking his sister down the aisle, but his mood was far from good. All evening, he kept replaying Alicia's hurtful words that from now on not even friendship would be possible between them. The officers sent to the resort hotel room in Door County entered and immediately discovered the body of 21-year-old Alicia Bromfield. She was lying naked on the floor, partially covered with a blanket. A pillow had been carefully placed under her head. At first glance, it looked as though the young woman was simply asleep, but upon closer examination of the body, officers noticed injuries, bruises, and scratches, signs that she had tried to defend herself. It was clear that she had fought until the very end for her life and the life of her unborn daughter. Forensic experts were called to the crime scene, while at the police station, Brian Cooper was being interrogated. The man explained that the day before, they had indeed argued over the hotel room situation, and Alicia had planned to go home. Later, she decided to stay so as not to ruin the celebration for Brian's sister. She told him that once they returned home, they would no longer be friends and would cut off all communication outside of work. Brian got angry. Her words hurt him. And that was when he began to think about making Alicia feel the same kind of pain, but physically. Brian told investigators that he and Alicia had been seeing each other and that things had been good between them. He went on to say that he had always wanted to have a relationship with Alicia. He wanted her to be his girlfriend, but since she was pregnant by another man, he claimed he had shown respect and kept some distance. So they went to the wedding, where they took their last photo together. Alicia tried to seem cheerful, but as soon as they returned to the hotel room after the ceremony and the party, she went to bed, wanting the day to be over as soon as possible. Luckily, the room had 2 beds. Meanwhile, Brian kept drinking. He was already quite drunk, but he knew that once they got back to Illinois, Alicia would cut all ties with him. While Alicia slept, he paced around the hotel room, poured himself more alcohol, and went outside for smoke breaks. The rage inside him was building more and more. He was angry at the sleeping girl for rejecting him. No matter what he did, no matter how he acted, she always remained unreachable. Uncontrollable fury took over his entire body. How dare she say she was going to cut off contact? Brian wasn't used to a woman making decisions for him. He was the one with power and control over her, being her supervisor. He was the one who always held authority. The fact that Alicia was now standing her ground, firmly saying she'd had enough, that she was done tolerating the insults and humiliation, inflamed his wounded male ego to an unbearable degree. With every drink he took, Brian lost more and more control. His behavior could no longer be called logical. He was afraid of losing Alicia, yet at the same time he desperately wanted to hurt her, to get revenge, so she would never dare reject him again. He began running through ideas in his head, how best to do it, what to use to take her life. At that moment, it was as if Alicia sensed the danger coming from her boss and woke up. She stepped out onto the balcony to get some fresh air. When she came back in, Brian suggested that after they returned to Plainfield the next day, they should meet up and watch a movie. But Alicia firmly said no. She intended to keep her word and cut off all communication with him. That's when something snapped in Brian's mind. Her refusal pushed him to what he did next. The man suddenly lunged at Alicia, who was sitting on the bed. He straddled her, wrapped his hands around her neck, and began to squeeze. The girl, completely unprepared for what was happening, panicked, and tried to fight back, trying to pry his hands away, but eventually she gave in. She begged him to stop and think about the baby. In her final moments, Alicia wasn't thinking about her own life, but about saving her unborn daughter, Lucille. But at that moment, Brian didn't care. He continued the attack. During the struggle, they fell off the bed onto the floor, and there, Alicia managed to bite his finger, only making him angrier. The man grabbed a phone charger cord and began strangling Alicia until she stopped resisting. Instead of calling an ambulance or trying to save the baby, Brian stripped the girl naked and, in a moment of unthinkable depravity, violated her lifeless body. He told investigators that he had wanted to see Alicia without clothes. After satisfying his vile desires, he covered her body with a blanket and placed a pillow under her head. The next part of his plan was to take his own life. Brian didn't want to face the consequences of his actions. He didn't want to be arrested or go to prison. He would have had to face everyone who knew him and somehow explain what he had done. Drunk, Brian tried stabbing himself with a knife and a corkscrew, but it hurt. He couldn't bring himself to inflict serious harm, so he locked himself in the bathroom and passed out in a heavy stupor. Brian woke up in the morning, stepped out of the bathroom, and couldn't even look at the body of the girl he had pursued for the last several years. Horrified, he left the hotel and headed to a nearby bay, intending to drown himself. Brian swam far out into the water and surrendered himself to the waves, but his survival instinct kicked in. His body fought to live, despite his desire to die. As a result, yet another suicide attempt failed. Sinking into depression, Brian made it to shore and wandered along the beach until he saw a gas station. When he walked in to call the police and turn himself in, water was still dripping from his clothes. That was the story he told investigators after his arrest. When detectives asked if he had ever had similar outbursts of rage before, Brian said that he had never taken anyone's life before. Alicia was his first victim. After the body was discovered in the hotel room, Alicia's family was immediately informed of what had happened. The most devastating part was that unborn Ava Lucille also died in her mother's womb. The grief of the family, who had been preparing to welcome a baby girl into the world, was immeasurable. Brian Cooper was charged with intentional homicide as well as abuse of a corpse. The judge set bail at $1 million. While he was being held in jail awaiting trial, police continued to build the case against him. In addition to Brian's detailed confession, which was recorded on tape, they were able to gather substantial evidence showing that Brian had abused his position and harassed Alicia both at work and outside of it for years. Investigators found further incriminating material on his computer, including several secretly recorded videos. Brian had installed a mini camera in his bathroom and recorded Alicia when she used the toilet after walking his dog. He had also hidden a small recording device in the trash can of the bathroom in their hotel room, filming her naked as she came out of the shower. All of this, and more, confirmed not only Brian's obsession with Alicia, but also underscored how deeply disturbed and depraved he truly was. The girl had no idea that her private moments in the bathroom were being rewatched multiple times. Even the password on Brian's mobile phone was Alicia's date of birth. Despite his confession to detectives, Brian decided to plead not guilty at trial, citing impaired mental state. He did not deny that he had committed the crime of taking the life of a young pregnant woman, but he sought to justify it. Brian's attorneys argued that, due to alcohol intoxication, their client was incapable of understanding what he was doing. According to them, he was too drunk to tell right from wrong. And therefore, Brian could not be held responsible for his actions that night, meaning he should not be held accountable for the death of Alicia or her unborn child. The prosecution, however, found serious flaws in that theory. Citing Brian's own confession, they pointed out that he was able to recall in vivid detail exactly what he had done to Alicia that night, something uncharacteristic of someone under the influence of alcohol. His failed suicide attempts also indicated that he understood the illegality of his actions. However, as unbelievable as it may sound, the jury was unable to reach a verdict, because 2 of the 12 jurors genuinely believed that Brian Cooper's state of intoxication absolved him of responsibility for the crime. Everyone was stunned by the outcome of the trial. This decision meant that Alicia's family would have to endure a second trial. But the verdict shocked Alicia's mother, Sherry, most of all. She was deeply troubled by the fact that the 2 jurors who prevented a conviction were women themselves. Essentially, they had decided that Brian Cooper should not be punished for the murder of a young woman and her unborn child, and the reason? That he had simply had too much to drink. In Sherry's view, with laws like these, anyone could commit a heinous crime and easily escape justice, so long as they got drunk first. She didn't want any other family to go through such pain. She didn't want to see more young lives buried because of violent, intoxicated criminals. That's why Alicia Bromfield's mother decided to take action. Sherry was so outraged by the outcome of the case that she led a campaign to change the laws. Together with other family members and her daughter's friends, she spoke out against the kind of defense strategy that had been legally permitted within the U.S. justice system. Sherry's team worked to spread awareness among the public. They wrote letters to local and higher-level officials. They created online petitions and held meetings with lawmakers in Wisconsin. And fortunately, after some time, the hard-fought battle for justice brought results. In the spring of 2014, about a year and a half after Alicia's death, Governor Scott Walker signed a bill officially banning voluntary intoxication as a legal defense in the state of Wisconsin. Sherry managed to help bring about legal changes in 32 states. However, those changes didn't apply to Brian, since the crime occurred before the new laws were enacted. Because the first jury failed to reach a unanimous decision, Brian was set to face a second trial for the murders of Alicia Bromfield and unborn Ava Lucille. The trial took place in May 2014. As mentioned earlier, Brian's defense team was still allowed to cite intoxication as a mitigating factor during sentencing. At the second trial, the jury once again heard about his disturbing obsession with Alicia and how he had abused his power as her supervisor. They saw the footage from the hidden cameras. They listened to Brian's confession, in which he described in detail his decision to take Alicia's life, despite her pleas and her concern for her unborn child. This time, the jury found him guilty on all counts. Brian Cooper was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. It is more than likely that this man will never walk free again. After her daughter's death, Sherry filed a lawsuit against Alicia's employers. She discovered that her daughter had repeatedly complained about abuse and harassment in the workplace by her direct supervisor, regional manager Brian Cooper. It turned out Alicia wasn't the only one. Other female co-workers had also filed complaints. They too had reported Brian's inappropriate behavior to upper management. Sherry sued the company, accusing them of negligence that led to her daughter's death. If they had responded to the complaints and taken action to protect their employees from Brian's harassment, the girls wouldn't have suffered. The company argued that the crime didn't occur on store property and that they weren't responsible for monitoring employees 24/7. Initially, Sherry's lawsuit was dismissed, but that decision was later overturned on appeal. Having endured 2 exhausting trials, Alicia's mother was determined that no other parent should go through the same ordeal. Sherry felt an overwhelming mix of rage and guilt for not being able to protect her daughter and unborn granddaughter. But instead of letting that anger destroy her, she transformed it. The most incredible part of this story is that Sherry ended up joining forces in her mission with Kelly Stryker. Kelly is a social worker specializing in mental health, child abuse, and domestic violence. But there's more. Amazingly, Kelly is Brian's sister, the very same sister whose wedding Alicia attended before she was killed. Kelly initially testified in court in defense of her brother, and while she had supported Brian, She was deeply disturbed by his refusal to take responsibility for his actions. Yes, life can be that complex. Kelly was moved by Sherry's mission to preserve Alicia's memory and became an inspiration to her. She reached out to Sherry and offered to help with the Purple Project as a way to try to make amends for what her brother had done. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. Demons cannot be cured with pills. That's exactly what Father Daniel believed when he was accused of killing a young nun. So what caused the girl's death? Mental illness or possession by evil spirits? This is a completely wild story that goes beyond the bounds of reality. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. At the top of a steep hill stood the Holy Trinity Monastery. It seemed to loom over the residents of Tanaku. Tanaku is a small, isolated village, one of the poorest regions in Romania, where water was drawn from wells. The only light illuminating the space at night came from flickering candles. Wooden crosses stood guard by every house, meant to ward off evil spirits. The village of Tanaku was a place where faith permeated every aspect of life. When it came to spiritual guidance and healing, people largely relied on the church, especially during difficult times. In April 2005, 23-year-old Maritika Irina Cornici arrived in Tanaku to visit her childhood friend, a young woman named Anel. Anel had already been a novice at the Holy Trinity Monastery for quite some time. Irina came to visit her, but ended up staying there forever, deciding to spend her remaining days on this earth in prayer. Maritika Irina Cornici was born in 1982 in Vaslui County, located in the northeastern part of Romania, near the border with Moldova. She had an older brother named Vasily. Irina's childhood was spent in a village very similar to Tanaku. From infancy, her life was filled with loneliness, neglect, and abuse. But that wasn't even the worst part. When Irina turned 2, her father took his own life. The man tightened a noose around his neck right in front of the children. So from a very young age, the girl had to witness horrifying events. One might hope that she was too little to remember or comprehend that traumatic incident. But children understand far more than adults think. The girl's mother, crushed by grief, had no idea how much her husband's action had affected their daughter. The woman never sought help from doctors, and Irina had to deal with the pain on her own. She had no one to simply talk to or cry with, as there weren't many close people around who could support her. The sudden and devastating death of her father haunted the girl for the rest of her life. After her husband's death, Irina's mother fell into a deep depression and found no better remedy than alcohol. The already difficult life of the family was worsened by the mother's alcohol addiction. It got to the point where the woman could no longer take care of her children, so Irina and her older brother were placed in one of Romania's infamous orphanages. The Romanian government, aiming to elevate the country's economy and pay off foreign debt, promoted a policy of increasing the birth rate. A larger population meant more jobs and more opportunities for trade with other countries. To boost birth rates, the sale of contraceptives was banned, and terminating a pregnancy was punishable by law. Childless citizens were taxed 30% of their income. The only women who could avoid forced childbearing were those over the age of 45 who already had at least 4 children. Motherhood became a state obligation for all women in Romania, causing many families to live in constant fear and extreme poverty. Young women, exhausted by constant childbirth, were unable to care for a large number of children. Mothers had neither the means nor the energy to care for their babies. Orphanages were constantly being filled with more and more children. At that time, Romanian orphanages were known for their inhumane conditions. They lacked even the basic staff necessary to care for so many children, so the kids were not properly looked after. Irina, like many of her peers, suffered from malnutrition, emotional neglect, and abuse. The years spent in the orphanage left an emotional scar on her soul. The overburdened staff subjected the children to all kinds of mistreatment. They were starved and beaten for the slightest offense. Humanitarian aid sent from other countries to improve the lives of these children was immediately stolen by corrupt administrators. No one knew exactly how many children passed through these horrific institutions. By 1989, there were at least 100,000 people in the orphanages. Between 1966 and 1989, more than 15,000 children died in the orphanages for various reasons, and it wasn't always due to illness. After the revolution in Romania in December 1989, journalists exposed some of the horrors taking place in those orphanages by publishing real photographs. The images were simply horrifying. There were disabled children with limbs as thin as sticks. In old, rusty cribs lay toddlers who had never learned to walk. They couldn't even lift themselves up. And in the basement were piles of corpses stacked on top of one another. These photographs shocked the entire world, including Romania itself, because everything that happened in those institutions had been carefully hidden. Despite the hardships, Irina managed to get through that difficult period in her life. She was helped greatly by a close friend from the orphanage, Anel. Irina was always searching for love and some kind of stability, so she grew close to the girl who was going through similar struggles. Their fates were, in some ways, alike. When she first entered the orphanage, Irina didn't fully understand the nightmare that surrounded her. She was often mistreated not only by the staff, but also by the other children. So as she grew older, she decided to learn how to protect herself. In the library, the girl happened to stumble upon a book called Karate Self-Study Guide and decided to learn some techniques to give herself at least some form of protection. Later, she joined a training group. Self-defense skills were essential for her survival. However, martial arts combined with psychological trauma led Irina to become an aggressor herself. Other children began to suffer from her sudden outbursts of anger, and it wasn't limited to strangers. More often, her rage was directed at those close to her, especially her best friend Anel. Irina, essentially, turned into a little monster. The girls remained close throughout their time in the orphanage, and Anel, always by Irina's side, became a living punching bag for her friend. It was on her that all the anger was unleashed. Anel became Irina's outlet for both physical and emotional release. Over time, their relationship took a truly dark turn, and their strange friendship became toxic. Irina developed a very strong attachment to Anel, which gradually transformed into romantic feelings. Irina was afraid to admit, even to herself, that she was physically attracted to the girl. At the time, non-traditional orientation was not just taboo, it was illegal. The girl's internal conflict grew stronger. Out of fear that someone might discover her true feelings, Irina became increasingly violent and once again took her anger out on her beloved friend. Irina openly showed contempt for people of different sexual orientations, just like the rest of the country. This was done, at the very least, as a means of survival. Amid the struggle with her intimate desires, Irina began to be haunted by traumatic memories of her past. She often heard the voice of her deceased father. The man had died when his daughter was just 2 years old, so it's unlikely she could actually remember what his voice sounded like. Most likely, these were auditory hallucinations. The stress and grief that had accompanied Irina from a very young age affected her psyche. These were the first symptoms of developing schizophrenia, the illness that would eventually lead Cornici to a tragic end. In 2001, at the age of 19, Irina finally left the cursed orphanage and moved to a place called Banat. Her brother Vasile was working there as a hired farm laborer. The girl also went there to find temporary housing and earn at least some money. Irina worked as a housekeeper for a family. As a result, she had her own little room and a hearty meal. She even managed to save a portion of her earnings. Overall, Irina was satisfied with the household work, so the temporary job turned into a permanent one. The young woman stayed in Banat for several years. Then she traveled to Germany a couple of times, where she worked as a nanny. She envisioned her future in that country. Irina planned to save up enough money to escape to Germany and start a new life. But throughout all those years, she never forgot her best friend, the one who had supported her and been by her side in the orphanage. After the Romanian Revolution, there was also a revival of Christian monasticism in the country. Believers were no longer persecuted, so many people returned to their ancestral traditions. In April 2005, Irina began searching for Anel and found out that by that time she had become a nun at the Holy Trinity Monastery in Târnacu. Irina wanted to visit her friend and convince her to emigrate from Romania to Germany. The Holy Trinity Monastery in Târnacu opened in 2001. It was a new and fairly simple building with a silver roof, constructed from concrete blocks and stones. Nearby was another, more modest building where the nuns lived. At the time, there were about 30 of them. So, Irina made her way to the Holy Trinity Monastery and found Anel. The girls went for a walk around the area to talk for a while. Both were overjoyed to see each other. Irina was quick to share her far-reaching plans with her childhood best friend. She told her about life in Germany and said she had come to take her with her. To her deep regret, Anel had already found her purpose, and so she declined Irina's offer. She explained that the Holy Trinity Monastery had something they had dreamed of all their lives, a wonderful sense of community. A childhood spent in an orphanage had never given them that feeling. Now Anel had achieved her goal and wanted Irina to experience the same emotions. In truth, Irina saw that her friend was genuinely happy at the monastery, and at some point, she really did want to join her. All she had to do was demonstrate how strong her Christian beliefs were. In return, she would receive 2 free vegetarian meals a day, a bed to sleep in, and a close-knit community that could protect her, care for her, and love her with all its heart. When Irina set out for the Holy Trinity Monastery, she had no intention of staying there for long. Her goal was to take her childhood friend and leave for Germany together. But her plans changed on the very first day after arriving, and Irina voluntarily moved into the isolated hilltop monastery. The girl simply wanted to finally be happy. However, her plans were not meant to come true. From her very first days at the monastery, Irina felt a deep emotional connection with the Mother Superior, a woman named Neonila, and with Father Daniel Petru Corojanu. Both Anel and Irina had been so emotionally drained since childhood that they began calling the Mother Superior Mom and Father Daniel Dad. The girls had no idea that the young priest's past was full of secrets. The 29-year-old Father Daniel Petru Corojanu was an unorthodox and radical figure in the Romanian Orthodox Church. He enrolled at the university to study law and also played football for the school's team. Eventually, he lost interest in both sports and legal practice, but became deeply fascinated by theology and religious teachings, spending an entire year on them. When construction began on the Holy Trinity Monastery in Târnacu, the young man volunteered to help. Then, for some unknown reason, the local bishop appointed him as a clergyman at the site. Even though Daniel had no qualifications or experience and was still a student, he was entrusted with running the monastery, simply because he had helped during its construction. The young man didn't hesitate to drop out of university to focus on managing the monastery. Father Corojanu had a long red beard and piercing green eyes. This gave him an air of authority and made him seem a bit older than he really was. He had a confident way of speaking and could easily capture the attention of an audience. At the same time, Father Corojanu was definitely not an ordinary priest. He completely rejected modern science and was strongly opposed to unity and cooperation among different branches of Christianity. As a progressive member of the Romanian Orthodox Church, Father Corojanu eventually clashed with local leadership who were concerned about his untraditional style of management. They read him the church statutes aloud, which were essentially a collection of official rules and guidelines. But the young priest dismissed those rules, calling them outdated. He advocated for innovations, which sparked a storm of criticism against him. Korojanu received official written warnings to change his lifestyle in accordance with accepted clergy standards. However, nothing changed. Father Korojanu was a strong and authoritative personality who, frankly, intimidated many people. In 2001, when the monastery first opened its doors, it was home to a community of monks, but gradually all the men left. Left alone with his thoughts and plans, Korojanu began accepting women who were completely devoted to him. By 2005, when Irina first met Father Korojanu, he already had quite a controversial reputation. The priest was engaged in attracting cult-like followers in the form of women from nearby villages. Rumors began spreading throughout the region that true absolution of sins could be found at the Holy Trinity Monastery. The members of the community themselves claimed they had been healed of all kinds of illnesses, evil, and curses. Father Korojanu liked these rumors. To him, they were a kind of advertisement. The Holy Father became deeply involved in religious rituals, particularly exorcism, and wanted his fame to spread throughout Romania. Exorcism is the procedure of casting out demons or evil spirits from a person, known in many religions since ancient times. The ritual usually began with prayers and commands for the spirit to leave the body. Holy symbols such as the cross and holy water were often used. According to Christian teaching, dark entities could possess a person. This was called demonic possession. The possessed individual would behave inappropriately and provocatively under the influence of the invading spirits. In response to the exorcism ritual, the demon inside the person would trigger a strong physical reaction. The person possessed by evil would start levitating off the bed, shaking, cursing obscenely, and frightening those around them. But the priest was to continue the ritual until the demons retreated, the afflicted person calmed down, and peace was restored. The exorcism rite was intense and frightening. It was typically considered a last resort when all else had failed. The Romanian Orthodox Church had only basic knowledge of exorcism. In most cases, the ritual involved a stream of prayers and spiritual texts. Since there were no established rules for how to perform this rite, priests like Korojanu began to invent more elaborate rituals to expel unclean spirits. This was most commonly practiced in superstitious rural areas like Tanaku. People there believed the church to be the only reliable source of healing. Instead of going to a hospital, they turned to religious figures, trusting priests more than doctors. Father Daniel Korojanu read extensively about exorcism. His favorite reading was a pamphlet called The Power of Holy Anointing, which spoke of how witchcraft and devil worship were on the rise, and more people were becoming possessed by demons. It stated that only saints could easily cast out demons because their faith was strong and they were filled with the grace of the Holy Spirit. Father Korojanu devoted himself to prayer and fasting, believing that he would soon become one of those saints mentioned in the book and be able to cast out the devil. The isolated monastery was fertile ground for his growing influence and control over the novices. In fact, the priest had a dream of becoming the most famous exorcist in Romania. Daniel wanted people afflicted with possession to be brought to him, and soon his dream came true, but in the most horrific and twisted way imaginable. On April 9, 2005, shortly after Irina entered the monastery, her behavior began to change. One day, as she was leaving a church service, Irina collapsed to the ground and started rolling around. She suffered a severe nervous breakdown. She grabbed stones from the ground and began hitting herself in the head with them. The monks gathered around the woman and prayed to God for her salvation. But Irina wouldn't stop and couldn't calm down. Eventually, they restrained her so that she couldn't harm herself or those around her. She was then placed in a car and taken to the hospital. When doctors noticed she had a fever, they sent Irina directly to the intensive care unit. Later, she was transferred to the psychiatric ward of the hospital, where a psychiatrist diagnosed her with a schizophrenic episode. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental disorder that affects how a person thinks, feels, and behaves. That is, their cognition and actions. People with schizophrenia may hear voices that aren't really there, suffer from delusions, experience memory and speech difficulties, and behave sluggishly. During periods of exacerbation, a person with this illness may harm themselves or others. Some individuals are born with a genetic predisposition to this mental illness. They may appear completely normal, but after undergoing severe stress, symptoms can begin to manifest. Irina's father had mental health issues during his lifetime, so she may have inherited a vulnerability to developing psychiatric problems. Irina's traumatic experiences, including her father's suicide, her mother's alcoholism, and the physical and emotional abuse in the orphanage, combined with her genetics, triggered the development of a mental illness such as schizophrenia. After 2 weeks in the hospital, Irina's condition improved. She continued to behave oddly, but was less aggressive toward others. After a short course of treatment, she was released into the care of the monastery. She was never given a proper psychiatric evaluation to confirm a final diagnosis. A nurse from the psychiatric ward told the nuns picking up Irina that the girl was most likely possessed by evil spirits, and therefore traditional treatments would not help her. But that one comment from the medical worker was enough to plant the idea in the mind of the Mother Superior that a demon had truly entered Irina. Of course, it was unprofessional for the nurse to make such assumptions, but the people in Tanaku were very superstitious. Upon discharge from the hospital, Irina was prescribed neuroleptics, medications that suppress emotional states and can eliminate delusions, hallucinations, and other symptoms of psychosis. These drugs are suitable for patients in the early stages of the illness, but Irina's condition had already been progressing for quite some time. The entire discharge process seemed rushed. The nuns later said they never received any discharge papers, and the doctors never explained Irina's diagnosis to them. As a result, Irina returned to the monastery, and for a time, her condition seemed to stabilize. The Mother Superior and other sisters helped the girl strive towards spiritual enlightenment. They advised her to fast, focus on prayer, and go to confession to cleanse her soul and begin a new chapter in life, leaving all her sins behind. About a month after Irina was discharged from the hospital, she took communion and officially became a nun. Her mental state, aside from a few minor oddities in behavior, could be considered relatively normal, but over time, her condition began to deteriorate. A few weeks after her first communion, strange and unexplainable things started happening again. She would suddenly burst into uncontrollable laughter during church services, periodically suffered from fits of rage, sometimes harming herself and others, and spoke in incomprehensible phrases. Her behavior frightened many of the nuns. The deeply religious and superstitious women of the Holy Trinity Monastery believed that Irina was possessed by demonic forces. Mental illnesses, especially schizophrenia, were poorly understood, particularly in poor and highly religious rural regions of Romania. Meanwhile, Irina's condition was getting worse. One night, she set fire to her room and then, without telling anyone, traveled to her brother in Banat. She had left all her savings in the rented room, money that she had intended to use for her move to Germany, hoping it would be safe there. Over several years of work, Irina had managed to save about 4,500 euros and now wanted to retrieve her money, but not to finally emigrate to Germany. Irina planned to donate the savings to the Holy Trinity Monastery in Tanaku. It turned out that the people Irina had worked for over the years had robbed her, leaving her with only 500 euros. What's more, other women were already living in her old room. This completely broke Irina's heart and became yet another major disappointment in her life. She had always trusted that family like her own, considered them close, while to them, she was probably nothing more than a hired worker. Once again, Irina felt utterly alone and could no longer cope with that level of betrayal. The realization plunged her into a deep darkness. As a result, her outbursts of aggression returned. Irina completely lost touch with reality. In schizophrenia, Any stress or disruption to one's routine can worsen symptoms or trigger a full-blown episode, and it seemed that's exactly what happened to Irina. On June 9, 2005, when she returned to the monastery, things got even worse. Just a moment earlier, Irina had been in a good mood, smiling. Then her eyes would suddenly widen, her entire body would tense up, as if a black mist had entered her mind and forced her to transform into a vicious monster. What followed were sudden, unprovoked fits of rage. Irina began talking to herself, mumbling strange things no one could understand, and lunging at those around her. The monks didn't do everything possible to stop the episode. They read prayers, washed Irina with holy water, and performed purification rituals. But nothing helped. The girl was getting worse and worse. She refused to eat or drink, and she had almost completely stopped sleeping. To prevent Irina from hurting herself, the nuns had to tie her to the bed using towels. Father Daniel Korojanu, the head priest of the Holy Trinity Monastery, was convinced that the nuns' behavior was caused by demonic possession. He never associated Irina's suffering with her mental illness. The priest firmly and sincerely believed that what she needed was not medical treatment, but an exorcism ritual to save her soul. Later, he would explain his actions by saying that Satan couldn't be cast out with pills. By the time Irina's schizophrenia symptoms had worsened, Father Korojanu had already performed similar demon-expelling rituals on other nuns. In doing so, he was strengthening his reputation in the region as a spiritual healer. On June 12, 2005, Father Korojanu and 4 nuns, Odina, Elena, Simona, and the Mother Superior, decided to perform an exorcism on Irina. They tied her to a wooden cross in the monastery church and began the ritual. While the priest conducted the exorcism, the sisters prayed and sprinkled the girl's body with holy water. The entire time, Irina kept cursing. The nuns had to shove a towel into her mouth to stop the stream of incomprehensible mumbling, which they believed was equivalent to blasphemous words against God and the Holy Father. All 5 participants believed they were saving Irina from possession, but in reality, they were simply torturing her. The girl was kept tied to the cross for 70 hours, almost 3 full days, completely deprived of food and water. The only thing she received was sprinklings of holy water. Irina was forced to remain in one position, with no ability to control her body. She was clearly suffering, but instead of helping her, the priest and the nuns only intensified her pain. They truly believed it was their duty to save Irina's soul at any cost. On the morning of June 15th, a church service was scheduled, one that usually attracted many villagers. Father Daniel understood they needed to do something about Irina, who was still tied to the cross in the middle of the church. So, at last, they removed her and carried her into the nuns' quarters. Despite being emaciated, dehydrated, and extremely hungry, at that moment, Irina seemed to be doing better. She was much calmer, stopped mumbling, and no longer attempted to harm anyone. One of the nuns offered Irina some bread and tea, and she even smiled for the first time in a long while. Father Korojanu was pleased, believing the goal had been achieved, until the story of the exorcism took a tragic turn. After eating a little, Irina fell into a quiet, deep sleep. The Mother Superior noticed that the girl's breathing was irregular, so she tried to wake her, but Irina didn't respond. Neonila checked her pulse. It was very weak. The Mother Superior panicked and sent for an ambulance. Paramedics arrived at the monastery around noon. On the way to the hospital, Irina's pulse could no longer be felt. The medic administered several adrenaline injections, hoping to restart her heart, but by the time the ambulance reached the hospital, it was already too late. Marisika Irina Cornici died at the age of 23. The nuns claimed Irina had been alive when she was loaded into the ambulance and blamed her death on the emergency workers, including the medic who administered the adrenaline. According to the sisters, the girl had died from an overdose of the medication. However, the on-duty physician who declared Irina dead upon arrival at the hospital stated that she had died much earlier than the nuns claimed. The doctor believed Irina had been dead for at least 24 hours. The cause of death was hypovolemic shock, a pathological condition caused by a rapid decrease in circulating blood volume. Shock can occur as a result of severe bleeding or excessive sweating. In Irina's case, it happened because she hadn't eaten or drunk anything for several days, and her body had been forced to remain in an uncomfortable position in which blood could not circulate properly. At the hospital, doctors noticed rope marks on the girl's wrists and ankles. It became clear that Cornishi's death was not accidental. The story took on an entirely new dimension. The already suspicious fatal outcome forced the medical staff to contact the police. In fact, the doctor who declared the patient dead was the first to accuse the priest and the nuns of causing the girl's death. The very next day, on June 16th, news of what had happened in Târnacu spread throughout the country, and the people of Romania were in complete shock. During Nicolae Ceausescu's rule, hundreds of monasteries had been shut down. After his fall from power, people rushed to return to religion and began rebuilding new monasteries. It all happened very quickly. The church did its best to properly select and train new priests. But as a result, many monasteries and churches ended up in the hands of poorly educated individuals, such as Father Corogianu. Due to a general mistrust in the government, people turned once again to religion. Churches and Orthodox monasteries became centers of spiritual support, especially in impoverished regions, and all that trust was shattered by the shocking exorcism case in Târnacu. The girl's funeral took place on June 20th in Barlad, the city where she grew up and where her orphanage was located. Of course, it's unlikely that the girl ever dreamed of returning to that place, but it was there that her painful journey on this earth came to an end, and she finally found peace. 7 days after the tragic death of Irina Cornici, on June 22nd, Father Corogianu and the 4 nuns who had participated in the exorcism were arrested. Police interrogated them for about 11 hours before charging them with aggravated murder. What happened to Irina was a highly controversial case because many people saw it as violence, but many others believed that Father Corogianu and the nuns were simply doing what they thought was best for the sister. They were trying to help her save her soul from demons. However, the girl's dead body was undeniable proof of deliberate physical abuse. Bruises and cuts on her skin showed that she had been forcibly restrained for 3 days. No good intentions can justify causing serious harm to another person. In this case, the law works differently. In an interview with national television, Father Corogianu said that only God knew why he took Irina, and then added that God wanted him to become a priest and cast out evil spirits from people possessed by demons. In other words, he placed the blame on the Creator. Father Corogianu truly believed that the exorcism ritual, after which the girl died, was part of a divine plan. As a result, the priest showed absolutely no remorse for what he had done. Members of the Romanian Orthodox Church understood the seriousness of the situation. After the case, Father Corogianu was defrocked. The church strongly condemned his exorcism ritual and shut down the Holy Trinity Monastery. The media went into a frenzy over the entire situation. Very soon, it was revealed that Daniel Corogianu had actually been ordained before completing his religious education at the university. The public was shocked, and this forced the church to implement even stricter rules for those seeking priesthood, including mandatory psychological evaluations for future clergy. Church leadership admitted that it had been too careless in appointing priests, and that this directly contributed to the tragedy in Târnacu. Still, Corogianu's followers saw things differently. Many people, especially in Târnacu, believed that Irina truly was possessed by evil spirits, and that Father Corogianu had saved her from that evil, even if he wasn't able to save her life. In some ways, Irina's death deepened people's devotion to religion. They blamed the doctors for her death and believed it was all part of a larger conspiracy against the church. The trial of Father Corogianu and the nuns became a sensation in Romanian media. The courtroom was packed with Corogianu's supporters. They prayed and wept throughout the entire trial. When the verdict was read, they broke down in hysterics. On February 19, 2007, Daniel Corogianu was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Mother Superior Neonila received an 8-year sentence, while the 3 other nuns, Odina, Elena, and Simona, who had not led the ritual but had participated in it, were each sentenced to 5 years. However, Corogianu's time behind bars was shortened. In 2011, just 7 years later, he was released early. One of his followers gave the former priest a cottage in a scenic location. Despite being defrocked by the Romanian Orthodox Church, Corogianu continued to live with the support of a small group of devoted followers, enjoying the remnants of the power the Church had once given him. The tragic death of Marisica Irina Cornici highlighted the danger of combining extreme religious practices with a poor understanding of mental illness. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. It was a warm summer evening in London. Sisters Biba and Nicole went to the park to celebrate one of their birthdays together. Unfortunately, they didn't know that a wicked monster was hiding among the trees and had been watching them for a long time. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. Today's story took place in the northwest of London relatively recently, in June 2020. It was a beautiful sunny day, the day Biba Henry was celebrating her 46th birthday. She and her younger sister Nicole decided to go to Friant Park, where a few friends and relatives were supposed to join them. There wasn't going to be a big celebration, since it was 2020, during the pandemic. At that time, the full lockdown in the United Kingdom had already ended. People were now allowed to go outside and even gather in small groups, while still observing social distancing. That's why many citizens, tired of staying indoors for so long, were happy to go out to parks and enjoy the fresh air. Nicole Smallman was Biba's half-sister. There was a 19-year age gap between them. Nicole was 27, and Biba had just turned 46. Despite that, the sisters were very close and had recently been living together. When Nicole was attending university, it was a long commute back home for her. But Biba had rented a place near the college. There was a spare bedroom in the older sister's apartment, so she invited the younger one to stay and live with her for a while. Both women were daughters of the former Archdeacon of Chelmsford, Wilhelmina, Mina Smallman. Mina, who retired in 2019, was the first woman from an ethnic minority to hold the title of Archdeacon in the Anglican Church. Biba Henry was happy that the weather turned out so beautiful for her birthday, so she invited her few guests for a picnic in the park. The gathering was set for 8 in the evening, when the daytime heat had given way to a gentle nighttime coolness. The sisters brought pillows from home, spread out blankets, took out snacks, and set up a small party. The group had a great time. They laughed, told stories, took pictures, and enjoyed the warm evening. Time flew by, and when all the guests had left, it was already midnight. Biba and Nicole were in no hurry to return home. For the celebration, they had brought a large string of lights to the park and hung it on the trees to create a magical atmosphere. And now, they were taking pictures of each other against the backdrop of the sparkling lights. The sisters were having a wonderful time, even after being left alone. But they didn't know that a stranger had been watching them from behind the bushes for a long time. The next morning, Nicole's boyfriend woke up and found that the other half of the bed was empty. His girlfriend had never come home that night. The young man checked his phone. It turned out that Nicole hadn't even bothered to send a message saying she wouldn't be coming home and would be staying at her sister's place. The last thing she had sent him were the words, "I'm dancing in the park." That was at 1:06 a.m. The boyfriend tried to call Nicole, but the call immediately went to voicemail. Then he dialed Biba's number, but her phone was turned off too. All of this was very strange, since Nicole had never acted like this before. She always let someone know in advance if her plans changed, and she certainly never turned off her phone. The boyfriend tried to reach out to the girl's friends and her family, but no one knew where the sisters could have gone. The relatives were slightly comforted by the fact that Biba and Nicole were both grown women. Maybe their phones had died. Instead of going home, the sisters might have had a crazy idea, like continuing the celebration somewhere else. At the time, the family tried not to panic and to think positively. For the rest of the day, the relatives kept calling the girls, texting them, and asking friends who had been at the party the night before. They even went to Biba's apartment, but no one was there. No one had seen or heard anything about the sisters. It was as if both women had vanished into thin air. There were very few reasonable explanations left for Nicole and Biba's disappearance. When the clock showed 9 p.m., almost a full day after the party in the park, the girl's mother, Mina Smallman, called the police and reported her daughters missing. By that time, the woman was seriously alarmed. All kinds of thoughts were running through her head. Maybe something had happened to her girls and they were in a hospital, or maybe they had gotten lost in the dark and became victims of an abduction. Mina provided the police with information about her daughters, their photographs, and described the location where they were supposed to celebrate the birthday. As expected, she waited for the officers to check the park first, but for some reason, law enforcement didn't do that. They took her statement, collected the women's photos, and simply returned to the police station to go about their routine business. The strangest part was that an investigation had supposedly started, but no one actually checked the last known location of the missing women. The family was confused. Although the police insisted they were working on the case, there was no evidence to support that. Nicole and Biba's mother had a growing suspicion that detectives were in no hurry to act, and that the reason was the victim's skin color. Mina was African American, as were both of her missing daughters. The male police officers didn't want to make an effort to search for black women. The whole family was disappointed and upset by the lack of urgency in the case, so the relatives decided to take the investigation into their own hands. They had no other choice, because they couldn't just sit around and wait. And since, for some reason, the officers weren't planning to search the park, the family decided to do it themselves. They spent the entire morning making missing person flyers for Biba and Nicole and posting on social media. By evening, they had made it to the park. By that point, Mina had already called all the hospitals in the area, asking if 2 women matching her daughter's descriptions had been admitted. But there was no solid information about any victims. Before heading to the park, the family organized something like a search party, which included several people who had been at Biba Henry's birthday celebration. Friends led the Smallman family members to the picnic site, but there were no signs of the missing sisters. There were no string lights, no blankets or pillows, no personal belongings of Biba or Nicole. Nothing that they had brought with them to the park that day. A glimmer of hope appeared. Maybe the girls had packed everything up and gone home. But if that were the case, then what could have happened to them on the way? The search party was already about to leave the park when one of them noticed Biba's sunglasses lying in the grass. Sunglasses she never went outside without during the summer. At first glance, it seemed like she might have simply dropped them in the dark. But for some reason, the discovery left an unsettling impression, as if something sinister was hidden behind those glasses left in the grass. That was what pushed the relatives to search the bushes and examine the grass around the picnic spot more thoroughly. And soon, they made a horrifying discovery. On the ground, they found a large knife, smeared with something red. It was lying just a few meters from the clearing where Biba and Nicole had celebrated the birthday. This discovery shattered the last hopes of finding the women alive and well. The family and friends feared that the sisters were already dead, since they hadn't made contact at all during all this time. Fear and emptiness quickly turned into anger toward the police, because it was the officers who should have searched the park right away and found that knife. The relatives immediately called emergency services and reported the discovery to the dispatcher. The operator told them to stop searching immediately, not to touch anything else, and to wait for the police to arrive. The problem was that the family had already waited 2 days for investigators to take the case seriously, but nothing had happened. The only progress in the case came solely because the family had taken the search into their own hands, so they ignored the dispatcher's instructions and kept searching. While the rest of the group carefully examined the clearing again, Nicole's boyfriend wandered off a little toward the trees by himself. He was trying to put himself in the shoes of a potential attacker, and guess what their next move would have been? That's when the rest of the group heard him let out a guttural, blood-curdling scream. Everyone immediately ran toward the trees. When they saw the young man, he was crying, screaming, and pointing at something on the ground. It was the lifeless body of his girlfriend, Nicole. She was curled up in a fetal position, pressed tightly against the body of her older sister, Biba. The sisters and their clothes were covered in blood, and their arms were intertwined, as if they had been hugging each other. It was clear the killer had staged it that way, and even without an autopsy, it was obvious the women had been stabbed to death. There were visible stab and slash wounds on their skin, mostly on the abdomen and arms. Clearly, the sisters had fought back until the very end, and the knife that had been found earlier was most likely the murder weapon. 27-year-old Nicole Smallman and 46-year-old Biba Henry were brutally murdered in the park on the night of the older sister's birthday. Their disappearance case was immediately reclassified as a double homicide investigation. News of the case spread across London instantly, and no one could believe what had happened. Henry and Smallman were respected members of their communities. Biba was a social worker who always approached her profession with great dedication. Her colleagues described her as a passionate advocate for the protection of vulnerable children and families. Despite having a fiery temper, she always treated people kindly. She was a friendly and confident woman. Nicole worked as a freelance photographer. She was very creative and super artistic. Both sisters were known as fun, sociable, and free-spirited women. Their tragic deaths were a huge loss to everyone who knew them. When the police finally arrived at the crime scene, they cordoned off the entire area with yellow tape and called in a forensic team. To ensure that no passers-by stumbled upon the bodies, patrol officers were stationed nearby, and as it turned out, those patrol officers were absolutely vile and cruel individuals who didn't deserve to wear the proud title of officer. 48-year-old Denise Jaffer and 33-year-old Jamie Lewis were assigned to guard the crime scene. They were supposed to stand just a few feet from the bodies and make sure no one approached them. But apparently, they got bored standing around doing nothing. Instead of protecting the dignity and honor of the crime victims, they started taking photos with the murdered sisters' bodies in the background. After goofing off and having what they seemed to think was a good time, the officers shared these images in a group chat on a messaging app. The chat included over 40 members, many of whom were also police officers. It was a work-related group. Colleagues asked Denise and Jamie what they were up to, and in an attempt at a joke, they sent selfies with the sisters' dead bodies and an offensive caption. The murdered Biba and Nicole were referred to by the two officers as daft birds. In the United Kingdom, as in many other countries, calling women daft birds is considered a derogatory and demeaning slur. And here were two law enforcement officers who were supposed to protect the public, mocking the remains of two slaughtered women. It was, at the very least, inhumane and cruel. It felt as if Nicole and Biba weren't even considered human. Fortunately, not everyone was so heartless. Several police officers from that group chat were appalled by the mockery of the victims' remains and immediately reported Denise and Jamie to their superiors. The two were promptly suspended from duty and later arrested and charged with misconduct. Investigations were also launched against 6 other officers who had either viewed the photos or were aware of them, but failed to report the incident to higher authorities. It was later revealed that this wasn't the first time the two patrolmen had behaved inappropriately toward people of other races. They had previously covered up crimes committed against Asians and African Americans. For instance, Denise Jaffer had boasted about hiding an attack on an Asian boy, or letting 3 white men go without even filing a report. As a result, in December 2021, the two officers were sentenced to 2 years and 9 months in prison. And although they only served half of their sentence, They will never again be allowed to work in law enforcement. The autopsy reports for Baba and Nicole were horrifying. The pathologist concluded that the older sister died first. She sustained 8 stab wounds. No defensive injuries were found on her body. It appeared that she died very quickly. Most likely, she didn't even have a chance to react or fight for her life. The younger sister suffered 28 different stab wounds and more than a dozen cuts. When the attacker went after Biba, Nicole tried to pull him away from her sister. That's when the assailant turned on Nicole, and a one-sided struggle began. Judging by the defensive wounds, the young woman fiercely fought back against the attacker. The autopsy reports also stated that the victims' bodies had been dragged across the ground. This was indicated by characteristic injuries found all along their backs. The attack took place at the picnic spot in the park, after which the killer dragged the women's bodies into the woods and arranged them as if they were hugging each other. The time of death for both sisters was estimated to be between 1:13 a.m. and 1:26 a.m. This specific time window was determined through physical evidence. After the attacker was done with the bodies, he disposed of all the picnic items. Blankets, pillows, handbags, and other personal belongings of the women were found dumped in the bushes near a lake in the same park. Biba's mobile phone played an important role in the investigation. That evening, the sisters had taken many pictures together. They had set the camera on a timer so it would take a photo every few seconds. The very last photo was taken at 1:13 a.m., and by 1:26 a.m., someone had attempted to unlock the phone, but the attempts failed. Police considered the theory that the killer, who had been watching the women from the bushes, saw them taking photos. Perhaps he feared he might have been caught in the frame and tried to delete the pictures, but was unsuccessful. Detectives working on the case had to analyze the photographs thoroughly. In one of the images, both sisters simultaneously raised their heads and looked in a specific direction. Investigators believe that this was the moment the attacker emerged from hiding. The women turned toward a noise and saw a stranger. During the crime scene examination, forensic experts discovered 3 different blood samples. The first 2 belonged to the sisters and were immediately identified. The third sample most likely belonged to the attacker. While fighting for her life, Nicole had wounded the assailant with his own weapon. That blood sample became one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. All that remained was to identify the potential suspect and compare their blood with the unknown sample found at the scene. In 2003, a law was passed in the United Kingdom that allowed police to collect DNA samples from anyone who was arrested, regardless of whether they were ultimately charged with a crime or not. The DNA was uploaded into a national database, which became a valuable tool for future investigations. One of the key advantages of this database was that even if there were no exact DNA matches, the system could still identify partial matches. This meant that if a relative of the perpetrator had their DNA in the system, investigators could significantly narrow down the suspect pool using a partial match. That's exactly what happened in the case of the 2 sisters. The system showed a partial DNA match between the unknown sample from the crime scene and a sample belonging to an elderly man with the surname Hussein. This Mr. Hussein had never been charged with anything, but somehow his DNA had ended up in the police database. It became clear that someone in his close family circle was likely involved in the murder of the 2 women in Friant Park. From that point on, every member of the Hussein family, especially the younger ones, became subjects of police interest. Investigators gathered surveillance footage from the street where Mr. Hussein lived. They reviewed footage from the night of the murders and discovered something very interesting. In the early morning hours, a young man was seen running up the driveway to the Hussein residence. Strangely, he wasn't wearing any pants and had wrapped a jacket around his waist. The lack of clothing looked suspicious. Perhaps he had gotten blood on his pants and decided to get rid of them. The young man in the footage appeared to be a teenager. Investigators learned that Mr. Hussein had a teenage son, who quickly became the prime suspect. The boy's name was Daniel Hussein, and he was 18 years old. Despite his age, he already had a history with the authorities and had previously been referred to the government's Prevent program. In the UK, this program is designed to identify individuals at risk of radicalization before they act on their dangerous beliefs or intentions. The goal is to prevent such outcomes by offering support through a team of professionals, including police, psychologists, and social workers. Daniel had been referred to prevent by his school. Teachers had discovered that he had been using school computers to search for and view suspicious content online. Daniel attended the sessions for 8 months. Eventually, the specialist concluded that he no longer posed a risk to society and scheduled follow-up evaluations 6 months and a year later to make sure he remained stable. A year later, Daniel was considered fully rehabilitated. Authorities believed he had learned his lesson and was no longer a potential threat. Daniel spent most of his time living with his mother in southeast London. His father, however, lived in the northwest part of the city, right near where the crime took place. Mr. Hussein's house was only a few minutes' walk from Friant Park. The father later admitted to police that he had been worried about his son for some time. He had a feeling that one day the police would come knocking with news of something terrible Daniel had done. And that day had finally come. Daniel Hussein was born on May 10, 2002. He was the oldest of 4 siblings. The boy was always antisocial and even aggressive toward those around him. He didn't get along with his family either. There were frequent clashes between him and his brothers and sisters, so intense that it sometimes required calling an ambulance or the police. Daniel didn't have any close friends or a girlfriend, so most of his emotional outbursts happened within the family. His peers didn't like Daniel. Many kids at school described him as creepy and repulsive, so he was always a loner. At the age of 15, Daniel was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder. Asperger's syndrome is a developmental disorder characterized by significant difficulties in social interaction, as well as restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior and interests. The term Asperger's syndrome is no longer used. It's an outdated diagnostic term. Nowadays, the condition is simply referred to as autism spectrum disorder. Daniel had a low need for support. His autism mainly manifested in social situations. He often felt depressed, and whenever something interested him, that interest would usually turn into obsession, another common trait of autism. Daniel found it very difficult to meet people, make friends, or communicate with girls. And yet, he desperately wanted to find a girlfriend. By the end of high school, Daniel was spending most of his free time on the computer, locked in his bedroom. And the biggest problem was the content he consumed and studied for hours. It included magical rituals, sacrificial offerings, real crimes, and similar topics. That's exactly what got him caught at school, leading to a referral to a prevention program. But Daniel didn't change. He just learned how to better hide his obsessions. In 2018, Daniel graduated from high school and enrolled in college, but he barely attended classes. Around that time, he became interested in demonology and became a fan of a social media blogger who promoted Satan worship. That blogger was named Matthew Lawrence, also known as Coetting. He was an American self-proclaimed occultist. He presented himself as a black magician who worked with the most destructive forces of the inner cosmos. Coetting was a member of the Order of Nine Angles, a group with a horrifying history of committing and encouraging vile acts such as terrorism, violence, and human sacrifice. All of this was supposedly done in service of Satan and demons. Coetting actively encouraged making deals with the devil and his servants to achieve specific goals. These deals usually involved fulfilling certain conditions in exchange for the desired outcome. Ketting's videos played a significant role in this case. During the pandemic, Daniel's mental state began to deteriorate. It became even darker and more troubling. He spent entire days watching videos on YouTube and was actively involved in an online forum called Become a Living God, dedicated to Satanism. Daniel practically worshipped Coetting and hung on to his every word. The forum's creator truly believed himself to be all-powerful and claimed that each of his followers could also gain power. All it took was making a pact with a demon and fulfilling a series of conditions. As already mentioned, Daniel was in a poor psychological state during isolation and was extremely vulnerable. He struggled with social issues and felt like he didn't belong. Girls didn't notice him, he couldn't control his life, and he was unable to achieve certain desires. Then came a mentor who claimed that anyone could get what they wanted, if they truly desired it. All they had to do was take someone's life to appease a demon. Daniel believed kidding and began engaging with the forum. He called himself a psychic vampire and asked other members to give him advice on how to make a pact with demons. They gave him detailed instructions, which he followed precisely. So the police began to take interest in Daniel after spotting him on surveillance footage. Using those same cameras, detectives tracked the teenager's movements on the day of the sisters' deaths and his actions in the days leading up to it. On June 3rd, 2 days before the murder of Biba and Nicole, Hussein entered a local supermarket and bought drinks, a pack of gum, several candles, a couple of lemons, and a set of kitchen knives. As it was later confirmed, the knife found at the crime scene matched exactly with the knives from the set Daniel had purchased. Before that, he had ordered a balaclava online that covered his entire face, along with 2 folding shovels meant for digging a grave, but the order hadn't yet arrived. On June 5th, Daniel left his home at 7 p.m. The sisters were killed after 1 a.m. What he did during all that time remains unknown. It's possible he simply wandered around the park, searching for a potential victim. The match between the knife Daniel had purchased the day before and the murder weapon became a decisive piece of evidence for the police. They believed there was enough proof to arrest the young man on suspicion of the double homicide. Early in the morning on July 1st, 2020, police showed up at the home of Daniel Hussein's mother and arrested him. He was taken to the police station for questioning. Investigators noticed fairly serious cuts on his hand, which only reinforced their belief that they had the right person. When they asked him what had happened to his hand, Daniel struggled to come up with an answer. He stared at his hand in silence, then looked around as if trying to come up with something convincing. Eventually, he came up with a story about being attacked on the street during a robbery attempt. Everyone around could tell he was making it up on the spot. After Daniel Hussein's arrest, police searched both his mother's and father's homes. There, they found a large amount of material that explained the young man's motives. The teenager's bedroom looked like a shrine. Its walls were decorated with various satanic symbols printed on regular paper. On the desk lay a homemade book of spells, filled with all kinds of magical nonsense, like how to gain control over people or how to defeat your enemies. But the most disturbing thing police found in Daniel's bedroom was 2 handwritten contracts, created and signed by him in blood. It turned out Daniel had followed the instructions of his favorite YouTube blogger and had made 2 pacts with 2 different demons. One contract was addressed to the King of Hell, asking him to make a specific girl from Daniel's school, whom he had a crush on, notice him and believe that Daniel was the one she had been waiting for all her life. That contract was relatively harmless. The second contract, however, was an agreement between the young man and Lucifuge Rofocale. Lucifuge is a demon, the so-called Prime Minister of Hell, who, under Lucifer's orders, heads Hell's government and controls all earthly treasures. In this second contract, Daniel essentially pledged to become a serial killer and offer regular human sacrifices to this demon. In the first part of the contract, Daniel laid out step by step how he would fulfill the agreement, promising to deliver at least 6 victims every 6 months. He specified that the victims would all be women. He then guaranteed that he would build a temple in honor of this demon. The second part of the contract described what Daniel wanted in return. His first request was to win the lottery. Not just any win, but specifically the jackpot. The teenager clarified that this could also come in the form of wealth and power obtained by other means, at the demon's discretion. In other words, he wanted a tangible reward in exchange for future sacrifices. Daniel's second request to the demon was that the police would never suspect him of any crimes. Both contracts were signed in Daniel's blood. He carefully wrote his name on the paper, scratching open his finger to do so. These agreements explained a lot about the boy's strange behavior. He had been acting in accordance with tutorial videos on YouTube, where Coetting instructed his followers on how to properly make contracts with demons. During questioning at the police station, the young man at first denied having any connection to the crime against the sisters. Then he stopped speaking altogether. Investigators pieced together all known facts and constructed an approximate timeline of the events that unfolded that night. So Daniel left his home at 7 p.m. Around midnight, he arrived at Friant Park. Under the cover of darkness, the young man remained unnoticed for quite some time. He watched Biba and Nicole while hiding behind the trees. Unfortunately, the women, absorbed in posing for photos, dancing, and enjoying themselves, weren't paying attention to their surroundings. Surrounded by the glowing string lights, they were completely exposed. Once the rest of the guests had left the park, Daniel focused on the two future victims. He already knew exactly how he would act, so the attack was swift. Daniel approached the women and launched a frenzied assault. First, he attacked Biba, stabbing her multiple times, then turned his attention to Nicole. She fought him, trying to save both her sister and herself. But Daniel was stronger and managed to overpower her. Afterward, he dragged the bodies into the wooded area of the park and, for some unknown reason, arranged them to appear as if the women were hugging each other. Then he returned to the picnic site and gathered all the evidence. He attempted to unlock the phone the sisters had used to take photos, but was unsuccessful, so he simply threw it on the shore of the lake, failing to toss it into the water. Before heading home, Daniel removed his blood-stained pants, apparently worried that his father might suspect something, and disposed of them as well. Since the pants weren't found among Biba and Nicole's belongings, he must have discarded them elsewhere. Daniel arrived home by 4 a.m., cleaned himself up, and calmly went to bed. The next morning, the wound on his hand began to bother him. Daniel went to the hospital, lying that he had been attacked on the street. He received stitches and was sent home without the incident being reported to the police. Over the next few days, Daniel kept a low profile and waited for the pact with the demon to take effect. He believed he had fulfilled his side of the bargain, and now he eagerly awaited a massive lottery win. Daniel had specifically purchased several lottery tickets, but none of them won. His plan for wealth had failed. It was all a delusion, but now he was a criminal who had taken the lives of two people. 18-year-old Daniel Hussein was formally charged about a month after committing the crime. His trial began a year later, in July 2021. Due to another outbreak of the virus, the defendant was not allowed to leave prison. He attended the court proceedings via video link. Daniel did not plead guilty, despite the overwhelming evidence. He fiercely denied all accusations against him and continued to claim that he had no idea who had attacked the two women in Friant Park. During the live broadcast of the trial, Daniel showed complete disrespect for the judge. He turned away from the screen, smirked, and laughed at various moments, rocked back and forth in his chair, tossed his medical mask into the air like a misbehaving schoolboy, and treated the process as if it were a joke. It's very possible that Daniel fully understood he had no chance of escaping punishment, and that he would spend the rest of his life in prison for his crime. Aside from the previously diagnosed autism spectrum disorder, a psychiatric evaluation found no other mental illnesses. The defendant was deemed mentally sound and fully capable of taking responsibility for his actions. In the end, Daniel Hussein was found guilty of the deaths of Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman, and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 35 years. Daniel will be 54 years old when he becomes eligible for parole. There is no guarantee he will ever be released, because a rational person who decides to exchange human lives for a lottery win should not be allowed back into society. After all, if Nicole Smallman hadn't bravely fought back and injured the hand holding the weapon, Daniel could have easily attacked more people that night. That young woman potentially saved several lives by sacrificing her own. The investigation sparked wide public debate about women's safety, police misconduct, and the dehumanization of people with darker skin. The victim's mother, Mina Smallman, called on the head of the Metropolitan Police to resign over the way the investigation was handled, and he did so in February 2022. The former Anglican priest also criticized the media for not giving enough coverage to the disappearance of her daughters. If two white people had been killed in a park, reporters would have broadcast it all over the United Kingdom. The case also triggered a conversation about the accessibility of harmful online content that influenced the teenager and pushed him to act. As a result, Matthew Lawrence's videos were removed from YouTube, and his social media accounts were banned for promoting violence. As for Daniel Hussein himself, his pact with the devil was fulfilled in a way. The girl he had been in love with did eventually notice him, but instead of love, he filled her with absolute disgust. Tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, these are all terrifying, uncontrollable, and often unpredictable. These natural disasters sweep away everything in their path. They can leave behind massive destruction, knock out power across an entire state, and flood streets and cities. But in today's story, a major hurricane in Florida became a colossal obstacle in the path of a double crime investigation, giving the villain a chance to escape justice. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew, a Category 5 storm, devastated the city. But as it turned out, it wasn't the natural disaster that took the lives of a woman named Rita and her daughter Lisa Ann Botto. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. One of the main characters in today's story is Rita. She was born and raised in Torrington, Connecticut. Shortly after finishing school, Rita married James Botto, and they had 2 children, a son, Alan, and a daughter, Lisa Ann. The young woman happily gave up her job and dedicated herself to motherhood. She took great joy in raising her children, investing her time, energy, and love in them. Rita wasn't just a mother. She was the most devoted protector of her son and daughter, always supporting and encouraging their every endeavor. However, when Alan and Lisa started school, Rita found herself alone in the silence of an empty house. To fill this void, the woman decided to take up something new and accepted a job as a school bus driver with a local company. This work brought her an unexpected sense of joy. She devoted the next decade to this new field. Rita wasn't just a school bus driver. She helped busy parents by safely delivering their children to school. Not everyone loves their job, but Rita genuinely enjoyed it. She watched her little passengers, saw them grow up, and took pride in their achievements, which the students often eagerly shared with her on the ride home. Rita built a friendly rapport with the kids, earning not only the respect of her colleagues, parents, and students, but also becoming something of an older friend to the school children themselves. Yet her true calling remained motherhood. Rita was especially close to her daughter. Lisa Ann, while in high school, became passionate about tennis. She trained hard, attended practices, but often lost due to stiff competition. Still, the schoolgirl refused to give up, diligently working on her strokes. Lisa set a goal to become the top tennis player in her graduating class. She spent endless hours training, refining her technique, pushing herself to the limit. And all that hard work finally paid off when Lisa won the championship title. It was the sweetest victory after so many disappointments and losses. Beyond her love for tennis, Lisa's true passion was baking. She had a special talent for turning various ingredients into delicious treats. The girl often surprised her friends and family with her creations and secretly dreamed of one day becoming a professional pastry chef, working on a cruise ship, traveling the world, and crafting unique desserts for guests. Lisa loved the idea of meeting people from all walks of life and cultures, delighting them with edible works of art. But that was just the beginning, as the high schooler's dreams stretched far into the future. Someday, Lisa dreamed of opening her own bakery, not only to showcase and monetize her talents, but also to share her knowledge and skills with aspiring pastry chefs and pass on her experience. Lisa Ann wasn't just attractive on the outside. Sparkling blue eyes, tanned skin, and long blonde hair. The girl had a wonderful personality. Despite some shyness and reserve, she possessed undeniable charm. When meeting new people, she needed time to start trusting and come out of her shell. Yet Lisa was always very positive, finding the bright side in any situation and seeing only the best qualities in others. Of course, she had friends at school, but her closest companion was always her mom. The same was true for Alan. Their relationship was less like that of parents and children, and more like the unbreakable bond and love found between best friends. In 1991, as Lisa was finishing high school, the family underwent significant changes. After 22 years of marriage, Rita made the difficult decision to divorce James. It wasn't easy, but she felt the separation was inevitable. For the first time in years, Rita had to navigate her problems on her own. She still had 2 grown children to care for. In addition to her job as a school bus driver, the woman took a position as a cashier at a local convenience store to make ends meet. Soon, her son Alan enlisted in the army, leaving all the household responsibilities on his mother's shoulders. Despite the heavy burden, Rita remained strong and never showed how hard it was for her. She didn't want her daughter to see her struggles. Parents often want to be superheroes for their kids and fear disappointing them. In short, the divorce from her husband had a profound impact on Rita. She developed a desire to leave Torrington, Connecticut, and start a new chapter in her life. The only thing holding her back was her daughter, Lisa. The mother worried it would be hard for the girl to leave her friends, her routine, and move to a new city. But she herself had long wanted to move forward and leave behind everything tied to tender memories of a happy marriage. Rita shared her thoughts with her daughter and hit the mark. It turned out Lisa was on the same page and ready for a change. She too often dreamed of living by the ocean in a state with warm weather year-round, where she could swim and play tennis all the time. Rita's brother, Thomas, had recently moved to Florida, to Boynton Beach, with his wife. It was their excitement and joy about life in a warm climate that caught Rita's attention and made her consider relocating. With her daughter's support, the woman began exploring different towns in South Florida. She wanted to live close enough to her brother Thomas, but also find a place where Lisa could play tennis. Eventually, she narrowed her search to a small town near West Palm Beach called Lantana. The town sat on the coast with sandy beaches. It offered a laid-back, year-round vacation vibe, where it was almost always warm and sunny. Palm Beach County meant sprawling estates, stunning beaches, and multi-million-dollar waterfront homes. The state of Florida was a place that drew countless tourists. People came there to enjoy the sun, ocean, and relaxation. But Rita and Lisa were heading to Florida to stay for good. Lantana in Palm Beach County seemed like the perfect spot for the mother and daughter, promising a sea of new experiences. They picked out the ideal apartment with spacious rooms, large closets, and a back patio. The apartment was on the first floor. Nearby was a lake where residents could go boating or fishing. Plus, there was a tennis court, which proved to be the deciding factor in choosing the place. But the biggest issue with Lantana and Florida as a whole was the region's vulnerability to hurricanes. Powerful tropical cyclones formed over warm ocean waters, bringing destructive winds, torrential rains, and towering waves that threatened the lives and property of residents. South Florida, and Lantana in particular, sitting on the Atlantic coast, was especially prone to such natural disasters during hurricane season, which typically ran from June to November. A key factor to consider was the potential danger of destruction. It ranged from flooding to fierce hurricane winds. While Florida's coastal communities often took steps to prepare for hurricanes and mitigate their effects, the risk of facing a natural disaster was the greatest fear and the biggest challenge for Rita and Lisa. Of course, the women weighed the pros and cons of moving to the region, but ultimately, the advantages outweighed the drawbacks, and the mother and daughter began preparing to relocate to sunny Lantana. Their impending move was met with concern from relatives, who were adamantly against the idea. They knew Rita often struggled with low self-esteem and had heavily relied on her ex-husband James for support in many areas of her life. Loved ones worried that she might face serious challenges and be unprepared for them. Though Rita was hardworking, managing finances had never been her strong suit. In the end, the move happened. The mother and daughter settled into a first-floor apartment with 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms with monthly rent. The place wasn't cheap, but the presence of a tennis court where Lisa could practice justified the high cost. The lives of the two women spun into a whirlwind of activity. Lisa devoted countless hours to training and improving her game. To help her mom and herself financially, the girl took a part-time job at a popular restaurant. Lisa was proud to contribute to the household. She managed to balance work, tennis, and school. She had recently bought a brand new sports car. Her next goal was to enroll in the Florida Culinary Institute to kickstart her career as a trendy pastry chef. Rita Botto found a job as a cashier at a Walmart near the beach. They were settling into their new home and even adopted two cats from a shelter named Doc and Freddie, who quickly became family favorites. The mother and daughter attended church together. Everything was going great. The Botto family had no reason to suspect their lives would soon end tragically. In fact, Rita's life as a free woman was just beginning. She had raised her kids and could finally enjoy some time for herself. A little over a year had passed since they moved to Florida. On the evening of August 21st, 1992, Lisa had a date planned with a coworker named David. The guy worked as a cook at the same restaurant as she did. They returned to their restaurant, but this time as guests, to celebrate Lisa's belated 20th birthday. Her actual birthday was July 2nd, but due to conflicting schedules, they hadn't been able to meet up and mark the occasion. David and Lisa agreed on 8 p.m. Over the past few months, the two had taken a couple of walks along the waterfront, and the restaurant meetup was their first official date. They chatted pleasantly, discussing Lisa's car purchase, her love for tennis, and life in Florida. The evening was filled with carefree conversation and the awkward excitement typical of a first date. Around 10:30 p.m., David walked Lisa to her car, parked on a nearby street. They hugged goodbye. Lisa smiled and said they were parting for just a few hours and would see each other at work tomorrow. Neither of them could have imagined it would be their first and last date. All week, Lantana residents had been trying to figure out if Hurricane Andrew would hit their town. Hurricane Andrew was a powerful Atlantic tropical cyclone, the third strongest hurricane to ever strike the continental United States. It formed on August 16, 1992. Initially, forecasts predicted it would make landfall near Jupiter, Florida, on August 25th. That was about an hour's drive from Lantana, where Rita and Lisa lived. However, the storm's strength and speed were underestimated. Ultimately, Hurricane Andrew hit the shore in South Florida and was set to pass directly over Lantana. The town's residents had a few days left to prepare. The next evening, on August 22nd, around 7 p.m., Rita's brother, Thomas, got a call from a worried coworker at the Walmart store who told him Rita hadn't shown up for her shift and hadn't even called in. Thomas tried reaching his sister and niece by phone, but couldn't get through. He realized something out of the ordinary had happened and decided to head to their apartment to make sure Rita and Lisa were okay. The storm was approaching, and the weather was already turning bad, so Thomas was concerned for his sister. Along with his wife, he set out for her place, already sensing something was wrong. He hoped, of course, that he'd arrive and not see Rita's car outside. That would mean his sister and niece had left, escaping the hurricane, but unfortunately, Rita's car was parked in the driveway. Thomas's heart sank. He knew if Rita were home and everything was fine, she'd have answered his calls. As he walked from the car to the door, dozens of thoughts raced through his mind. He tried to find a possible explanation for his sister's silence. Thomas knocked on the front door, and no one answered. His worry grew even stronger. Since he had a spare key, he used it and peeked into the living room. Something terrible had clearly happened there. Items were scattered across the floor, and his panic mounted. The man quickly searched the apartment, and when his gaze landed on the hallway floor leading to the master bedroom, he noticed his sister's legs sticking out from the doorway. At that moment, Thomas's wife approached the front door, deciding to come inside too. He reached out to stop her. He knew it was better for his wife not to see what had happened inside the apartment. Even Thomas, who had served in the army for several years, wasn't prepared for the scene he found in Rita and Lisa's home. A wave of horror washed over him as he realized his niece and sister were most likely dead. Thomas ran out of the apartment, grabbed his wife, and frantically rushed to find a phone to call 911. Within minutes, police arrived. They confirmed Thomas's worst fears. Rita and Lisa had died as a result of an attack. Law enforcement officers taped off the crime scene perimeter and secured the area. The first thing the detectives noticed, there were no signs of a break-in. The sliding glass door was locked. Thomas had opened the front door with his key. The investigators walked through the apartment and realized solving the crime wouldn't be easy. This made them nervous. The thing was, a storm was approaching. It was unclear how much damage it would cause. They could lose all potential evidence. The apartment might flood. The wind could tear down walls or rip off the roof. Or it might even destroy the building entirely. And perhaps the police would never crack this case. Before collecting any evidence, the detectives decided to record the crime scene on video. The attack most likely took place in the living room. Furniture items were strewn across the floor. In the kitchen, all the cabinets were open, as if someone had been searching for something. Yet, at first glance, it didn't look like the house had been robbed. At the entrance to the master bedroom lay the body of an adult woman, face down. It was the 45-year-old apartment owner, Rita Botto. She was dressed in a cotton nightgown. There was an obvious gunshot wound to the back of her head. The victim's arms were stretched above her head, with clear marks on them. It seemed her hands had been tied, though no rope was on them now. The entire bedroom was splattered with blood. 20-year-old Lisa Botto lay on the bed, face up. Her lifeless, fully naked body had been left in a rather degrading pose. Her legs were deliberately spread apart, and her face was covered with a pillow. Judging by the pools of blood on the floor near the bed, this wasn't the position she'd died in. The killer had intentionally moved her body to further humiliate her. Before that, the victim had clearly been assaulted. Marks on Lisa's arms suggested she'd been tied up too. There were so many clues in this apartment that the investigators knew it would take hours to piece everything together and form a theory about why these women had been killed. But Hurricane Andrew was set to hit Lantana's shore within the next 48 hours. So the detectives hurried, trying to document as much evidence as possible in case anything was ultimately destroyed by the weather. Several key pieces of evidence stood out. A pillow from the living room couch had 2 distinct bullet holes. It had surely been used as a silencer. Investigators also found a bloody fingerprint on a sheet and several hairs that didn't match Rita's or Lisa's. On the bathroom counter sat a kitchen knife next to a hairbrush. Though no firearm was found at the scene, they discovered a .22 caliber bullet casing. There were marks on a stand where a TV had been, but the TV itself was gone. A VCR had also disappeared. Plus, Lisa's new car, which she'd recently bought, was missing. Investigators wondered, was this a botched robbery? Maybe the thief had been caught off guard by the homeowners? 4 cigarette butts were found in random spots around the apartment, and a 5th was on the floor beneath Rita's body. They were a well-known brand. But the thing was, neither Lisa nor Rita smoked. Given the number of cigarette butts, the perpetrator had been in the apartment for at least half an hour. The upside was that these clues could provide real DNA from the killer. The detectives also noted that a pair of Lisa's classic shoes stood neatly by the apartment's front door. Perhaps the girl, returning from her date the previous night, had deliberately taken off her shoes at the entrance to avoid waking her mom. At that moment, the attacker crept up behind her, and Rita emerged from her bedroom at the sound. As investigators pieced together possible scenarios, Hurricane Andrew drew closer to Lantana. Chaos descended on the town. Residents rushed to stores to stock up on essentials like water, food, batteries, and electronics. Supermarkets were packed with people eager to buy generators to prepare their homes for potential power outages. Many simply didn't know what to expect from the storm. On August 23rd, the day after Rita and Lisa's bodies were found, the girls' missing car turned up in the parking lot of a local club. Inside were Lisa's driver's license and wallet, but the car keys were gone. The car's interior was quickly checked for fingerprints. However, the search yielded nothing. With the storm closing in, they had to act fast. Hundreds of people were bustling about, so there was simply no chance to identify potential witnesses. On top of that, an evacuation order was in effect, and many residents were abandoning their homes to head inland. The investigators first spoke with Lisa's co-workers at the restaurant. David, the guy she'd gone on a date with the night before, was immediately ruled out as a suspect. He had a solid alibi for the night of the crime. David felt deep guilt for not walking the girl home. But what could he have done against a gun? He'd likely have become another victim. Soon, the detectives got their first lead. The tip came from Alan Bado. The young man suspected his own father, James Bado. Alan told police the man didn't seem upset when informed of his ex-wife's and daughter's deaths. James was fixated on money and resented having to pay alimony after the divorce. He'd made it clear he disagreed with the court's ruling. So could the man have taken the lives of two people close to him over money? Investigators planned to speak with James in person, but Hurricane Andrew derailed their plans. Only a few hours remained before the storm hit the town, so the police had to focus on other suspects. The detectives' attention shifted to Rita Bado's neighbor. During questioning, one of the building's residents mentioned a 26-year-old guy named Gary Whitmer, who lived in the apartment above the murdered family and had previously worked at Walmart with Rita. At the time of the crime, Gary was unemployed. He was often seen at the court where Lisa played tennis. Maybe he'd had a romantic interest in the girl and, after being rejected, decided to take revenge. The police were drawn to Gary's car, parked in the lot near the building. Inside, detectives spotted cleaning supplies, which immediately piqued their curiosity. The first thing they noticed was a cigarette tucked behind his ear. It was the same well-known brand as the ones found in the Bado apartment. Plus, the guy got very angry when questioned. He mentioned he'd been friends with Rita and was sad to hear of her death, but Gary never once mentioned Lisa, though he was closer in age to her. The storm was closing in. The detectives didn't have time to get a search warrant. They asked the young man if they could check his apartment, but he flat out refused. They then offered Gary a chance to give an official statement at the station and provide a DNA sample, but he refused that too, claiming he had nothing to do with the murders of his two neighbors. The guy promised to talk to the police only after hiring a lawyer. On top of that, the detectives were temporarily pulled from the investigation and assigned to a task force handling hurricane aftermath, so the case of Rita and Lisa Bado's murders was pushed to the back burner. Investigators had to return to headquarters and start preparing for emergency responses to incoming reports. Hurricane Andrew was one of the most destructive hurricanes in U.S. history. It tore through the northwestern Bahamas, South Florida, and southwestern Louisiana. It made landfall in Florida on August 24, 1992. It was classified as a Category 5, the highest rating on the scale. Andrew caused massive destruction and led to the deaths of at least 65 people across the region. Damage totaled $27 billion. The storm's winds leveled entire neighborhoods, leaving thousands homeless. It toppled trees and power lines and flooded coastal settlements. The investigation into the Bado case resumed only after the hurricane subsided. By then, the killer was far beyond the state's borders, and tracking him down would be very difficult. Rita and Lisa's memorial service took place on August 28th at the church they regularly attended in life. After that, they were cremated and their ashes were returned to their hometown of Torrington, Connecticut, where they were buried. Investigators headed there too, to speak with Rita's ex-husband and the father of Lisa and Alan. It was established that James Bado was in another state on the night of August 22nd and couldn't have been responsible for his daughter's and ex-wife's deaths. But the police suspected he might have hired someone to carry out the killings. Lisa might have been an unintended victim. Detectives dug into James's background, financial ties, and recent activities. They uncovered some intriguing details about his life, but they had no connection to Rita and Lisa's deaths. The investigation hit a dead end. the police had to shift their focus to other theories. This case would surely have drawn far more media attention if not for the hurricane that swept through Lantana. Everyone was busy trying to return to normal life and clean up the storm's aftermath. People were more concerned with their own lives than someone else's death. The Bado's neighbor, Gary Whitmer, vanished without a trace. No one knew where he'd gone during or after the hurricane. The police tried to find new leads and suspects, but there simply weren't any. Detectives questioned hundreds of Lantana residents. A neighbor of Rita and Lisa reported seeing a suspicious man near their apartment the day before the murders. He was of average height, with messy blonde hair. He looked about 25 years old. The problem was, the neighbor couldn't recall specific details for an artist to create a sketch. The woman even agreed to hypnosis, but the resulting composite still didn't yield any solid leads. By September, detectives recorded a segment for a crime show, airing a reenactment of the crime on TV, hoping to encourage viewers with information to contact the police. But that didn't produce anything worthwhile either. A year later, authorities repeated the failed effort, discussing the crime on a crime series and showing the hypnosis-generated sketch. Yet again, they got no significant leads in the investigation. In reality, the police had DNA from the presumed killer, taken from the cigarette butts and fingerprints. But this case happened in 1992, when there wasn't a centralized database and technology wasn't as advanced as it is now. The only thing the forensic expert could do was extract the DNA sample and store it in a freezer for better times, which he did. The runaway suspect, Gary Whitmer, Rita and Lisa's neighbor, was finally found in May 1994, in a morgue. The man was discovered in his apartment in Long Island, New York. He died of a drug overdose. Gary's DNA and fingerprints showed he had no connection to his neighbor's deaths. On July 15, 1995, 3 years after Rita and Lisa's deaths, Palm Beach officers made a tragic discovery. A 28-year-old local woman, Denise O'Neill, was found dead in a canal. Her body was wrapped in a pink sheet. The death of another young woman reignited interest in Rita and Lisa's case. The circumstances of Denise's death were eerily similar. She'd been assaulted, too. Her car was stolen and then abandoned. But the most chilling similarity was that the girl worked at the same restaurant as Lisa and had been on a date the night before her death. Such coincidences sparked speculation among investigators and the public that the same killer was at work. However, it soon came to light that Denise O'Neill had been killed by 2 young men who lived near her. They both confessed to the murder. The investigation into Rita and Lisa Bado's deaths hit another dead end. Months passed, then years. A computer system emerged that stored DNA profiles created by federal, state, and local forensic labs across the United States, the CODIS database. Given the brutality of the attack, investigators genuinely believed the killer would strike again, or that it would turn out this wasn't his first crime. And that's what happened. On December 9, 1991, 9 months before Rita and Lisa Bado's deaths, another crime occurred in Lantana. In a small one-story home, the body of 40-year-old Martin Gatt, a clerk, was found on his apartment floor. He'd been stabbed multiple times. His murder shocked his co-workers, as Gatt was known as a diligent employee who got along with everyone and had no enemies. Comparing DNA samples from the crime scenes revealed that the same perpetrator was responsible for both cases. Because different departments handled the cases, the connection between the 2 crimes wasn't established until years later, in 2001. Then came another breakthrough. During a routine check through the CODIS database, an employee found a match with a DNA profile. The sample from the Bado apartment was linked to a prisoner in a Wisconsin jail. He was a 41-year-old drifter convicted of armed robbery, arson, resisting arrest, and selling illegal drugs. His name was James Anthony Frederick. Now that this man was the prime suspect, police traveled to Wisconsin where Frederick was serving a life sentence to question him about the night Rita and Lisa Bado died. But the officers learned nothing useful. James didn't confess to anything. When shown photos of the victims, he said their faces looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't recall where he might have seen them. Now the police faced a big task to prove James was responsible for the mother and daughter's deaths. In 1992, hair and blood samples were collected from the convict to compare again with evidence from the crime scene. Detectives also ran a background check on James Frederick and found that in 1992, during the attack on the Baidos, he'd been living in Lantana. James had an extensive criminal history. He'd been in and out of jail since his teenage years. Frederick moved to Florida after being paroled early from another state. People who knew James, including his brother, described him as a rough, ruthless, and violent man. He had a short temper and could lash out at anyone who disagreed with him even slightly. When James was convicted in Wisconsin for robberies in 1995, he even tried to attack the prosecutor and threatened to kill him. The gun he used in those robberies closely resembled the weapon from the Bado case. Despite a thorough investigation, detectives couldn't establish any direct link between James and the deceased Rita and Lisa. These people had never interacted with each other, but the detectives tracked down a woman James had lived with in Lantana. His ex-girlfriend said that one day he came home in a brand new car matching the description of Lisa's. A TV and VCR were on the back seat. He planned to sell them. That summer, James was heavily into illegal drugs and constantly needed money. The case was piling up with more and more circumstantial evidence. When the DNA analysis results came back, it was confirmed that James Anthony Frederick was indeed responsible for the horrific crimes committed against the Bado family. Though the man insisted on his innocence, the evidence against him was irrefutable. Frederick was to be extradited to Florida for trial. The reason this man attacked and killed the two women would remain known only to James Frederick. The prosecution team theorized that the killer was drawn to Lisa's new car. He figured the girl was well off and there'd be valuables in her home. That's why he waited for Lisa that evening as she returned from her date and attacked her. Hearing the noise, Rita rushed out of her bedroom. The assailant tied both women up and sat them on the living room couch. That's where investigators noticed signs of a struggle. Then he took the TV and VCR from the house before returning to finish what he'd started. It's possible James was under the influence of illegal drugs at the time. The man dragged Lisa to the bedroom, stripped off her clothes, and assaulted her. Since Rita was shot at the bedroom entrance, she might have tried to protect her daughter somehow. Or perhaps James deliberately assaulted the daughter in front of her mother. What really happened can only be guessed. The only person who could shed light on this crime is James. Yet he claimed he didn't remember the whole situation because his mind was clouded by psychoactive substances. In April 2003, James Frederick was charged with the murders of Rita and Lisa Bado. Since Wisconsin didn't have the death penalty, but Florida did, the Wisconsin governor refused to extradite James until Florida agreed not to seek the death penalty against him. The two governors reached an agreement on possible sentencing, and Frederick faced trial in Florida. In the end, James took a plea deal. On November 28, 2005, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder with a firearm and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. And only in October 2006 was James Frederick's DNA matched to evidence in the case of Martin Gatt, the clerk who died in Lantana 9 months before the attack on Rita and Lisa. At that point, James was still serving his sentence in Wisconsin before beginning his life term in Florida, so he had to be extradited again. Ultimately, Frederick never faced trial for the attack on Martin because he was already serving a life sentence. This man would remain in prison until the end of his days, so for the sake of Martin Gatt's family and loved ones, it was decided not to pursue further charges against him. Natural disasters sweep away everything in their path, but sometimes one person can cause just as much devastation, upending the lives of several families. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. Meeting the love of your life, breaking free from parental control, and getting married. This is what most teenage girls dream of. Caroline Crouch was no different from her peers when, at a young age, she fell in love with a 27-year-old pilot who flew a helicopter over her school. The handsome adult man named Babis Anagnostopoulos captured the heart of the young girl when she was just 15 years old. They started dating. And when Caroline turned 18, the lovers ran off to Portugal and got married. No one could have imagined that this perfect fairy tale would end in tragedy. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. On Tuesday, May 11th, 2021, at 4:30 a.m., Babis woke up to find his home under attack. He, his wife, and their little daughter were renting a 2-story stone house in the suburb of Glika Nera, a district located on the outskirts of Athens, Greece. Babis didn't have time to fight back, as 3 men, concealing their identities under hoods, pounced on him and, while he was still groggy from sleep, easily overpowered him. The intruders were armed with pistols. Wasting no time, they tied up the homeowner, taping his eyes and mouth shut with duct tape. So he could do nothing when the strangers attacked his wife, 19-year-old Caroline. The entire incident woke their 11-month-old daughter, who was sleeping nearby in her crib. The criminals, speaking with Greek and Albanian accents, repeatedly demanded to know where the money was, but Caroline didn't know. What started as a typical robbery ended with the death of Babis's young wife. Caroline Crouch was born on July 12, 2001, in Athens, to a retired engineer, David Crouch, and his wife, Susan Della Cuesta. When she was just 8 years old, the family moved to the island of Alonissos, a Greek island in the Aegean Sea. This girl grew up and graduated from high school. Her parents loved the coastal surroundings, and Caroline enjoyed life on the beach and took a serious interest in scuba diving. Caroline met her future husband during a Friday parade in 2017, when Babis was a commercial helicopter pilot and Caroline was just an ordinary schoolgirl. 3 years later, they got married. A few days before the robbery, Babis and Caroline bought a plot of land where they planned to build their dream home for themselves and their little daughter. Her parents wanted to help Caroline and gave her a generous gift, 50,000 euros, which the girl spent on purchasing the plot. The couple also had 10,000 euros set aside for construction expenses. The spouses kept the money at home, in a hidden spot. The Greek public at the time didn't particularly trust banks, as they were constantly at risk of bankruptcy. In light of such circumstances, it was common for the general public to keep cash in their homes, as it was considered a safer option. Caroline and her husband likely held a similar view and kept all their savings at home, never expecting their residence might be targeted for a robbery. On May 11th, 2021, when his wife started screaming, Babis couldn't take it anymore and told the intruders where the money was hidden. The men opened a box containing the board game Monopoly and scooped out all the cash the couple had saved for building their dream home. But even that didn't seem enough for them. The criminals kept roaming from room to room, stealing jewelry and other items that held any value. The robbers wanted more, but Babis and Caroline had given them everything they had, and now, in desperation and fear, they begged to be spared and for their little daughter to be left unharmed. The man heard his wife's screams as the intruders pointed a firearm at their 11-month-old baby. His eyes were taped shut, but he could feel the fear for her daughter's life that Caroline was experiencing. Beyond the taped eyes, the rope around his neck was tightened to such a degree that he periodically lost consciousness and slipped into oblivion. Eventually, Babis passed out completely. Coming to amid the grim silence that filled the house, he realized the robbers were gone. The only thing that pulled him out of the darkness was the desperate cries of his little daughter. The man didn't know what had happened, where his wife was, or whether any harm had come to the baby. By his internal sense, he had been unconscious for about half an hour. Somehow, with great effort, Babis managed to reach his mobile phone and dial the emergency services number with his nose. As soon as the dispatcher answered, the man tried to explain the situation. Given that his mouth was taped shut, his voice sounded very muffled, and the operator didn't immediately make out the words. It took an hour and a half from the time the intruders burst into the couple's residence before emergency response personnel arrived at the scene. Around 6 in the morning, they rushed down the stairs, entered the house, and were stunned by the sight before them. All the living spaces, the kitchen, and the bathroom were trashed. Drawers were completely emptied onto the floor, clothes and other belongings scattered throughout the space. And atop it all lay an open Monopoly game box, the very box where Babis and Caroline had hidden their money. The emergency response team immediately noticed a security camera lying on the living room couch. It looked as though it had been ripped from the wall and tossed onto the sofa. The memory card was missing. It wasn't among the items strewn about the house. The next scene shocked the police. On the staircase, hanging by its own leash, was a white and brown husky puppy. It was unclear why the criminals felt the need to strangle the dog. It was still so young. Babis was found on the floor in the master bedroom. His eyes and mouth were sealed with duct tape that reached down to his neck, and a rope bound his hands and feet behind his back. Caroline lay on the bed. Her little daughter was beside her. The girl was crying and clapping her hands, trying to wake her mom. The baby herself was unharmed, though her condition left much to be desired. Caroline Crouch was declared dead. Doctors examined the young woman's pale skin and concluded that her death had been violent. Law enforcement officers freed the homeowner from the ropes and removed the tape. When Babis saw the lifeless body of his wife, the woman he had been in love with for the past 5 years, he rushed to Caroline and began to scream. The grief-stricken man couldn't believe his beloved was no longer alive. After ensuring the infant's safety, the police began questioning Babis. According to his version of events, 4 men were involved in the attack. 3 of them entered the house, while the 4th stood watch outside. The sequence went like this. One robber approached the house via a dirt road that led to the back entrance. Since breaking it open didn't work, he removed the security pins from a basement window and climbed inside. First, the intruder took out Roxy, the couple's 7-month-old husky, by hanging her over the staircase with her leash. Perhaps the criminal feared the dog would make noise and prevent them from sneaking into the house unnoticed. After that, he let in 2 more accomplices by opening the door from the inside. Then, the 3 of them headed to the master bedroom, where Caroline, Babis, and their little daughter were. After learning where the money was kept, the robbers pulled the cash from the box and turned the entire house upside down, looking for other valuables. And before leaving, they returned to the bedroom and smothered Caroline with a pillow. At that moment, Babis was unconscious from the tightly tied rope around his throat. The intruders might have assumed he was dead and left, thinking they hadn't left a single witness behind. However, it turned out that Caroline's death wasn't instantaneous. The 19-year-old young woman endured an attack that lasted about 6 minutes. This was evidenced by bruises all over her body and defensive wounds on her arms and legs. Bruises on her lips and tongue hinted at the possible use of some sharp objects. There were no signs of assault. Though the damage inflicted on the couple's home was immense, the intruders left no concrete evidence behind. The only thing the police found in the house was the hood of one of the criminals. Based on how Babis described the events, it was concluded that the hood must have fallen off when the homeowner put up a fight. And yet, the dropped hood was enough to provide a minimal idea of what one of the attackers looked like. Babis described him as a tall, dark-skinned man with excess weight. Relying on the eyewitnesses' recollections, experts compiled a rough sketch. Though the head of the household was disoriented, he managed to identify 2 firearms the criminals used to threaten the homeowners. According to Babis, they had a black pistol and a silver Colt. Investigation details revealed that the intruders got away with 10,000 euros in cash and jewelry worth 20,000 euros. The police also concluded that professionals were at work, not breaking into a random house, but observing this specific family and waiting for the right moment to strike. Authorities classified the attack on Caroline as an act of brutal violence. It could have been the actions of someone with pronounced antisocial tendencies and a lack of emotion. Questions immediately arose. If the robbery achieved its goal, why take the young woman's life? What was the motive for her killing? Could the criminals have been under the influence of illegal substances, unable to control their actions, even though they managed to escape, leaving almost no evidence? Or perhaps Caroline saw their faces and recognized them. For a time, Crouch had trained in martial arts. Given her level of physical fitness, it's reasonable to assume she fought back with all her strength. But standing up to 3 grown men was no easy task for a young girl. Most likely, the intruders had to silence her to keep things under control. Caroline started screaming when one of the attackers pointed a gun at her daughter. Any normal mother would stand to the last to protect her child. And to cool the woman's defiance, the robbers might have killed her. In general, investigators had many different theories, but they were all just assumptions. The police were certain of one thing: the attack on the couple was premeditated. The intruders knew exactly where money was hidden in the house. The gang might have gotten a tip from someone the couple knew. That's what the police had to figure out. During the investigation, they also reviewed footage from surveillance cameras at nearby homes and businesses. In the recorded material, detectives identified a dark-colored car followed by a motorcycle. The vehicles were circling around the couple's house that early morning, but tracking where they went afterward proved impossible. Caroline Crouch was buried 3 days after her death. Her burial took place on the Greek island of Alonissos, the place where she spent her childhood and youth. Babis paid tribute to his wife, recounting how lucky he was to have met her on his path. He had been happy all those years because his beloved was by his side. The grief-stricken man now found solace in the fact that their daughter, a piece of Caroline, remained with him. While loved ones said goodbye to the deceased, a car was stopped for a routine document check in northeastern Greece. Inside was a 43-year-old Georgian citizen heading toward the Bulgarian border. During the document check, the officer noticed the passport was clearly fake. Soon, this man was identified as Georgi Karadzashvili, a violent criminal with multiple prior convictions. He was wanted for 12 burglaries committed across Athens over the past 6 months. But the police were interested in something else. Several of the crimes had taken place in the area where Babis and Caroline lived. One of them occurred in December, when Karadzashvili and 3 accomplices broke into a house through a rear window. They attacked a woman and, threatening her with a knife, stole money and jewelry totaling 10,000 euros. The next attack happened on March 7th, just 2 months before Babis and Caroline were targeted. These incidents matched in many details. And finally, the last piece. The captured robber's appearance suspiciously matched the sketch compiled from the husband's description of the victim. Thus, the police had evidence gathered against Karadzashvili, including a history of violent break-ins, an attempt to flee the country, and a resemblance to the sketch. The police were almost certain they had found the right man. He was arrested and placed in custody. And though the criminal was pressured not only mentally, but also physically, which is a violation of rights, he, even despite a concussion, maintained his stance and claimed he had never heard of Caroline Crouch. The evidence the police had against this man wasn't enough to charge him with the crime, and Karadzashvili walked free. However, as a result, 3 police officers were fired, and several others were demoted. Continuing the investigation, the police turned their focus to a local Albanian organized crime group. Initially, they had a list of 100 people, which later narrowed to 10. Babis was shown photos of each potential criminal from this group of 10, but he couldn't identify any of them. Solving the case required more time. A reward of 300,000 euros was offered for information leading to the capture of the robbers. But no one knew anything about Caroline's case, and the substantial cash reward went unclaimed. By then, Athens residents were living in fear, unsure who might be the next victim. Media reports stated that the attack on Caroline was an unprecedented case where the criminals left absolutely no evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints. Despite the lack of results, the Crouch family and Babis Anagnostopoulos were grateful to law enforcement for their efforts to unravel the complex case. The husband of the deceased supported the police's efforts and continued speaking to the media to keep Caroline's case from being forgotten. Babis was also active on social media, answering questions and thanking people for their ongoing support. A breakthrough came on June 17th, 37 days after Caroline was brutally killed. On the island of Alonissos, the young woman's loved ones held a small memorial service. Many noticed several police officers among those present, and a police helicopter stood on a vacant lot near the cemetery. Investigators waited until the event concluded, then discreetly approached Babis and asked him to accompany them to Athens, as new information had emerged in the case. The man needed to identify a suspect, and the now widower agreed, unaware of what lay ahead. By that point, investigators had considered numerous theories and analyzed key details from the night Caroline was killed. Those details didn't add up. Babis told the police the intruders broke in through a basement window, but that window turned out to be very small. Given the assumed large build of the suspect, it followed that the basement window couldn't have been the entry point. Babis also insisted the house had been trashed by the robbers. However, neighbors told the police that no suspicious sounds came from the house that night. No commotion, no barking dog, no cries for help, no babies' wails. As it turned out, the memory card from the security cameras had indeed been removed, but data from the device showed it was taken out at 1:20 a.m., hours before the criminals supposedly entered the house. Additional details came from the fact that Caroline wore a smartwatch that tracked her pulse. Readings at 3:58 a.m. indicated she was asleep, but by 4:05, her pulse spiked by 50%, suggesting severe physical and emotional stress. Caroline's heart stopped at 4:11 a.m., and this happened before Babis claimed their home was attacked. The man himself had a fitness app on his smartphone. Data from that program showed he was moving around at a time when he was supposedly tied up. Detectives even tried to recreate how a bound homeowner could dial emergency services, but no one managed to do it with a taped face. The investigation revealed that Caroline had tried to book a hotel room for herself and her daughter that night. A text message sent to a friend also showed the young woman planned to leave her husband. In the early years of their marriage, Caroline studied at a college in Athens, while Babis continued working as a pilot. They were both active on social media, sharing glimpses of a happy family life. Judging by their social media accounts, the couple had a relationship filled with love and romance. However, the story in Caroline's personal diary belonged to an entirely different genre. There, the girl often questioned her relationship with this man. In 2019, she wrote about a serious argument and mentioned wanting to leave Babis and go to her sister. Her husband increasingly resorted to manipulation. He became obsessed with control. Babis wanted to isolate his wife from everyone, but not every girl is willing to turn into a housewife at 19. Caroline was a university student and didn't earn money. Her mom sometimes sent her some, but Babis immediately took the money so his wife wouldn't be tempted by anything. In her diary, the girl wrote that she loved Babis so much she couldn't leave him, even though the relationship caused her pain. Her attempts to end the marriage continued even after she became pregnant. But Caroline stayed. She wanted her child to grow up in a complete family. The personal diary revealed to detectives the young woman's clear intent to leave her husband. What began as a fairy tale love story turned into an abyss for Caroline, filled with pain, horror, and despair, from which she couldn't escape. Investigators informed Babis that he was suspected of killing his own wife. They interrogated him for 8 hours before he broke down and confessed to taking Caroline's life. The man claimed they argued because his wife wanted to take their daughter and leave. He lost control when his spouse was the first to turn to physical violence. She threw the baby into the crib and attacked her husband with her fists. Babies claimed that at that moment, his mind went blank. He pushed Caroline onto the bed, pressed a pillow to her face, and leaned on her with his full body weight. He took the life of his child's mother right in front of their 11-month-old baby. At first, the man wanted to dispose of the body but realized it was impossible. Then it occurred to him to stage a home invasion, and to make it believable, he even killed Roxy, the 7-month-old husky. After all, no one would think he could harm his own pet. Then Babies placed his daughter next to his wife's lifeless body. He wrapped himself in duct tape, called the police, and tied his hands and feet with rope. Babies was so confident he'd get away with the crime that he didn't bother destroying key evidence. In May 2022, he was charged with murder committed in the heat of passion, obstructing justice, giving false testimony, and animal cruelty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, plus an additional 10 years for hanging the dog, along with a fine of 20,000 euros. The Crouch family gained custody of Babas and Caroline's daughter. Now, the girl will have to grow up without the closest person in the world, and that's deeply saddening. No matter how hard criminals try to evade justice, retribution will catch up with them sooner or later, and excessive confidence will only hasten the reckoning for their sins. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.